Long before the name Troy echoed as a symbol of war, wrathful gods and immortal heroes, it existed as a strategic and vibrant point between East and West. To understand the Trojan War in all its depth, we must first look at the world where it was born. The Aegean region at the end of the Bronze Age was a mosaic of maritime kingdoms, palaces with their own writing systems, trade routes extending as far as Egypt and Mesopotamia, and a constant interaction between culture, faith, and power. The three great civilizations that stood out in this landscape were the Mycenaeans, the Minoans, and the Trojans, each with distinct social structures, languages, and symbols, yet interconnected through wars, alliances, and constant seaborne trade. The Minoan civilization, centered on the island of Crete, was one of the most advanced in the region, flourishing between 3000 and 1400 before Christ. Its political and spiritual center was the Palace of Knossos, a true labyrinth of halls decorated with frescoes of bulls, priestesses, and religious rituals. The Minoans were navigators, merchants, and artisans. They had their own writing system, known as Linear Auma, which remains undeciphered, and they seem to have a less militaristic society compared to their mainland neighbors. The importance of women in their cults and the recurring presence of the bull, later absorbed into the legend of the Minotaur, left deep marks on their religious and aesthetic identity. But the Minoan civilization would not last forever. A cataclysm, perhaps the eruption of the volcano of Santorini around BU 600 before Christ, devastated the island and weakened its structure, paving the way for the rise of the warriors of Mycenae. The Mycenaean or civilization, emerging in southern mainland Greece, inherited much of what the Minoans built, but with a fundamental difference. The Mycenaean world was geared for war. Cities such as Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos were protected by cyclopean walls, made of stone so massive that later Greeks believed they had been built by giants. Mycenaean kings, known as wanaks, ruled vast regions with firm hands, while a military elite controlled the fields and trade routes. The Mycenaean script, called Linear B, is an archaic form of Greek and was deciphered in the 20th century, revealing detailed administrative records of wine, weapons, textiles, and offerings to the gods. The Mycenae of Agamemnon, the supposed commander of the Trojan War, was a true center of power, both military and spiritual, with monumental beehive-shaped tombs where war chiefs were buried with weapons, golden masks, and riches now considered among the greatest treasures of archaeology. And then, between the Cretan world and mainland Greece, stood Troy, or Ilion, as it was called by the ancient Greeks. The city of Troy was located in what is now Turkey, on the shores of the Dardanelles Strait, a crucial passage between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea. This strategic position made Troy a bridge between cultures. Archaeologically, the city was rediscovered in the 19th century by amateur archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann, who excavated the hill of High Hisarlik and revealed layers upon layers of overlapping cities, each destroyed and rebuilt over centuries. Troy 6 and Troy 7, dated between 1700 and 200 before Christ, are the most likely candidates to have inspired Homer's myth. They had massive walls, defensive towers, and signs of violent destruction. The real Troy was a sophisticated commercial hub, trading with the Hittite world to the east, the Egyptians to the south, and the Greeks to the west, perhaps even charging tolls on ships that passed through its domain, which in ancient times could have been reason enough to trigger a war. These three civilizations coexisted, but they also competed. The tension between Minoan and Mycenaean merchants, the Mycenaean quest for territorial expansion, and Troy's strategic position created the stage for a war that, though wrapped in divine poetry, may have originated from very human economic interests and political rivalries. There is archaeological evidence that Troy suffered violent destruction and fires at various times, including a collapse around 1200 before Christ, precisely the period traditionally attributed to the war, narrated by Homer. But what is fact and what is legend? What came from the poet's quill, and what was recorded on the clay tablets of Mycenaean cities? The dawn of these civilizations not only shaped the foundations of the future Trojan War, but also influenced the entire mythological and cultural tradition of the Greek world. The tension between the real world and the mythological one was already present at this point. kings treated as demigods, palaces that became labyrinths of legend, battles that inspired eternal poems. Even before Helen left Sparta or Achilles put on his war sandals, Troy already bore the weight of a destiny that, real or not, would never be forgotten. For centuries, the Trojan War was considered nothing more than a beautiful legend. For many modern scholars, everything known about Troy came from the works of Homer. The Iliad and the Odyssey, epic texts probably composed between the 8th and 7th centuries before Christ, centuries after the events they describe. For a long time, historians regarded these epics as poetic myths with no factual basis. Troy was a place of poetry, not of stone. Everything changed at the end of the 19th century, when an eccentric, wealthy, and antiquity-obsessed man decided to prove Homer right. That man was Heinrich Schliemann, a self-taught German merchant who would become one of the most controversial figures in modern archaeology. Schliemann was not a trained archaeologist. He made his fortune at a young age through commerce and devoted much of his adult life to studying ancient languages and memorizing entire passages of Homer in classical Greek. He firmly believed that the Iliad described actual historical events and that Troy had indeed existed. His conviction led him to fund excavations on the hill of Tap Hisarlik in the northwest of modern-day Turkey. In 1871, with little scientific methodology and a great deal of enthusiasm, he began to dig with impatient hands, removing tons of soil, ignoring stratigraphy, and unknowingly destroying more recent and precious layers of Trojan occupation. Yet amid this destructive process, he found what he believed to be the lost city of Troy. What Schliemann actually discovered was only part of the story. The hill of Hisarlik held 9 major layers of occupation, each representing a city built upon the ruins of the one before. The layer he attributed to Homer's Troy was named Troy II, dated to around 2500 before Christ, far earlier than the supposed date of the war. Still, Schliemann announced to the world that he had found Homer's Troy, reinforcing his claim with the discovery of a set of golden jewelry, which he called Priam's treasure, naming it after the Trojan king described in the Iliad. The problem? The jewels came from a much older layer and therefore could not be related to King Priam or the war in question. Despite methodological errors and the inaccurate attribution of his finds, Schliemann's excavation reignited global interest in Greek antiquity and raised a fundamental question: what if Troy really existed? After Schliemann, other more careful archaeologists, such as Wilhelm Dörpfeld and Parrot Carl Blegen, continued the excavations, identifying that the layers most compatible with the period of the supposed war were Troy VI and Sars Troy 7R, dated between 1700 and 1200 before Christ. Troy VI was a fortified city with cyclopean walls and advanced urban planning, but it was likely destroyed by an earthquake. Troy 7R, which followed shortly after, shows clear signs of fire, violent destruction, and hurried reconstruction, elements that align with the narrative of a sudden and devastating war. Over the decades, archaeology in the region became increasingly sophisticated. Studies based on ceramics, architecture, organic remains, and geological analysis helped build a more realistic portrait of historical Troy. And it was indeed an important city. It controlled crucial maritime and overland trade routes, linking the Aegean to the Black Sea, and served as a point of connection between Eastern and Western civilizations. This strategic role reinforces the hypothesis that conflicts with Mycenaean powers could have occurred, not necessarily as described by Homer, but as economic and territorial clashes. Instead of a war for love, it may have been a war for maritime control and influence. Even so, Schliemann remains an ambiguous figure in archaeology. He believed in his mission with almost religious fervor, and this led him to make serious mistakes, from rushed excavations that destroyed crucial evidence to smuggling archaeological artifacts. But it was also his enthusiasm that placed Troy at the center of scientific and cultural debate of the time. He showed the world that myths could have real roots, and that ancient texts, however fantastical they might seem, could contain precious clues about humanity's distant past. His work paved the way for a new field of study, the archaeology of myth. Today, the archaeological site of Troy is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Modern excavations continue to reveal details about the city, its massive walls, elite houses, commercial zones, and even sophisticated drainage systems. The Troy emerging from the Turkish soil is a real complex city, with layers of destruction and reconstruction spanning millennia. The question of whether there truly was a Trojan War as described by Homer remains open, but there is no longer any doubt that Troy existed, nor that it was important enough to inspire legends that have lasted more than 3,000 years. Myth and history, at last, are inextricably intertwined. Long before the rise of the great city-states of classical Greece, such as Athens, Sparta, or Corinth, there was an ancestral time when the Mycenaean kingdoms ruled the mainland, each governed by kings who held political, military, and religious authority. This Greek world before the Trojan War was fragmented but intensely active. Each king, or Wanaks, ruled over a region with immense walls, administrative palaces, storehouses, and temples. In Pylos, Tiryns, and especially in Mycenae, the palace was the center of life, a place of command, economic production, and contact with the divine. The power of the kings was not merely military, but deeply symbolic. They were seen as representatives of the gods on earth, and often claimed descent from mythical lineages that blended mortals and demigods in their genealogy. This Mycenaean world was profoundly shaped by a high culture of honor, prestige, and glory. War, plunder, and conquest were not only means of survival or expansion, but ways of acquiring kleos, the immortal fame that would survive death. This pursuit of eternal recognition shaped values, decisions, and even disputes among leaders. In a society where oral memory was the foundation for transmitting values, reputation was as valuable as gold. Single combat, ceremonial looting, offerings to the gods, and public feasts reinforced hierarchy and consolidated the prestige of kings, princes, and warriors. In this world, to die with glory was preferable to living in obscurity. Alongside the power of kings and warriors, the Greek world was intensely religious and theocentric. The gods were not distant. On the contrary, they intervened directly in human destinies. Each Mycenaean city worshipped protective deities, generally more archaic versions of the gods, later known in the Olympian pantheon. Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, Athena, and Apollo were already revered, but with aspects still intertwined with natural forces and local spirits. Temples were smaller than those of the classical era, but religious practices involved animal sacrifices, wine libations, incense burning, and consultations with oracles. The gods were volatile and demanding. They could favor an army or destroy it for an insult, a poorly made offering, or a broken oath. It is in this environment that the profiles of the heroes who would later lead the Trojan War begin to take shape. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, was seen as the most powerful among the Mycenaean kings, with vast resources, numerous armies, and a lineage marked by curses. His brother, Menelaus, ruled Sparta and was married to Helen, considered the most beautiful woman in the world. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, was known for his intelligence, cunning, and distrust of the gods. Achilles, the greatest warrior of all, was the son of a goddess and a mortal, a symbol of the tension between divine fate and human passion. Each of these leaders carried a past, a motivation, and a particular relationship with the gods. And all were bound by promises, alliances, and oaths made during times of peace, oaths that would soon demand a price. Another essential aspect of this world was the practice of marriage between kingdoms as an instrument of power and balance. Royal women were offered as wives in diplomatic exchanges aimed at ensuring stability, access to resources, or the strengthening of military alliances. That is how Helen, daughter of Tyndareus, king of Sparta, became the wife of Menelaus, a marriage celebrated by countless suitors and sealed with a pact. All who had courted Helen swore to protect the chosen one, whoever he might be. This oath, conceived by Odysseus, seemed harmless at the time, but it would become the trigger for an unprecedented pan-Hellenic mobilization. With all of this, the Greek world before the war was ripe for a conflict of massive proportions. There was pride, rivalries among kings, an active military structure, jealous gods, and sacred oaths that could not be broken without consequences. It was a world where words held eternal weight, and where offenses, even those of love, demanded blood as reparation. In the end, Troy would not merely be the target of a romantic vengeance, but the stage on which this entire universe would unfold. Kings driven by honor, gods interfering with whimsy, and heroes in search of the one thing that could make them immortal, their names sung by bards to the sound of lyres for millennia. At the heart of the narrative that gave rise to the Trojan War lies a mythological episode filled with symbolism, divine pride, and irreversible human consequences, the so-called Judgment of Paris. Long before the Mycenaean ships crossed the Aegean Sea toward the walls of Troy, the fate of the war had already been sealed by an apparently simple gesture, the throwing of a golden apple. This gesture was born from a dispute between goddesses and would ignite a chain of events that crossed from the realm of the immortals into the world of men. The story begins on Mount Olympus during the wedding of the hero Peleus and the goddess Thetis, parents of Achilles. All the gods were invited, except Eris, the goddess of discord. Offended, Eris appeared uninvited and threw into the midst of the feast a golden apple inscribed with the words, "To the fairest." The gleaming object fell at the feet of three powerful goddesses: Hera, queen of the gods; Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and seduction. Each claimed the title of the fairest. Unable to resolve the dispute among themselves, they appealed to Zeus for a decision. But the father of the gods, fearing the consequences of taking sides, delegated the judgment to a mortal, Paris, a Trojan prince who had been raised far from the palace as a humble shepherd after prophecies foretold he would bring ruin to his city. He was a handsome, sensitive young man, enchanted by the harmony of the natural world, qualities that perhaps explain why he was chosen to judge the goddesses. The three descended to Mount Ida, where they found Paris. There each tried to convince him with seductive promises. Hera, mistress of power and marriage, offered him dominion over all the kingdoms of the earth. Athena, goddess of reason and strategy, promised him infinite wisdom and victory in every battle. Aphrodite, however, offered something more intimate and irresistible, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Enchanted by the goddess of love's promise, Paris handed her the apple, sealing the judgment. Aphrodite emerged victorious, but the price of that choice would be paid in blood. This mythical episode is more than a tale of vanity. It represents the tension between power, wisdom, and desire, and how choosing one over the others can alter the course of history. The woman promised by Aphrodite was Helen, daughter of Zeus and Queen Leda. Described as possessing unmatched beauty, Helen was already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Her marriage, as we have seen, had been secured by an oath of honor among the most powerful kings of Greece, including Agamemnon, Odysseus, Diomedes, and other heroes. By accepting Aphrodite's gift, Paris not only coveted what was not his, but violated the sacred bonds of hospitality, marital fidelity, and inter-kingdom honor. Aphrodite, faithful to her promise, led Paris to Sparta, where he was warmly received by Menelaus. During his stay, Aphrodite inspired in Helen a powerful passion for Paris, or perhaps enchanted her heart with divine magic. Either way, when Menelaus left for Crete, Helen departed with Paris, taking with her not only her beauty, but also wealth, honor, and diplomatic stability. The abduction, or voluntary elopement, depending on the version, of Helen was the immediate spark for the mobilization of the Mycenaean kingdoms. Menelaus, devastated by the loss of his wife and the public insult, invoked the ancient oath. All Helen's former suitors, who had sealed the union with a promise to defend her, were now bound to aid him, and thus a matter of love became a casus belli, an uncontestable reason to gather an army without precedent. Homer makes us believe that the gods were in every detail. Fate was already sealed, and Paris was merely a pawn in a larger game. Others, however, interpret the episode as a refined critique of human passions, selfish desires, and the unforeseen consequences of our choices. This judgment, which might seem like just a moral allegory or a mythical fairy tale, reveals a much broader dimension within Greek tradition. It teaches us about the fragility of alliances, about how pride and desire can manipulate even the most powerful, and how destiny can be determined by seemingly small decisions. The apple of discord thrown by a rejected goddess did not divide only three deities. It divided worlds, sparked kingdoms into conflict, shattered families, and gave rise to the most sung war in all of antiquity. The city of Athens, Sparta, located in the southern Peloponnesian peninsula, would forever be linked to the name of Helen, not only because of the beauty of the queen who lived there, but because of the central role she played in the most legendary conflict of antiquity. Long before Sparta became associated with the military rigidity and extreme discipline of classical Greece, it was an important Mycenaean center, a kingdom with its own palace, a robust agrarian economy, and sacred rituals intertwined with politics. It was within this setting that the marriage of the Menelaus, brother of the powerful Agamemnon, and Helen, daughter of Zeus and the mortal Leda, took place. Their union was not merely about love or beauty, but a grand diplomatic arrangement designed to balance power, protect Sparta, and bind the fates of the Mycenaean kings in a silent pact of war and honor. Helen, even in her youth, was already known as the most beautiful woman in the world. Her fame transcended the borders of continental Greece, and her name was whispered among kings, princes, and seafarers. It is said that as a child, she had already been abducted by the Theseus, or the hero of Athens, signaling how coveted her image was and how her body was viewed as a political prize. When she came of marriageable age, the number of suitors was so great that King Tyndareus, her adoptive father, feared that choosing one would provoke the wrath of the others and spark civil war among the Greeks. Then, Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, proposed a pact. All of Helen's suitors must swear to protect her future husband, whoever he might be, in the event of any threat to the marriage. That oath, which seemed merely a formality at the time, would become the moral foundation of the Trojan War. Menelaus was chosen. Though not the richest or most renowned, he was the brother of Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, and the most powerful of all Mycenaean lords. This political connection strengthened the marriage and guaranteed Sparta not only an alliance with the greatest power in the region, but also protection and stability. The marriage of Menelaus and Helen sealed both of their fates. He became the ruling king of Sparta, and together they appeared to embody the balance between strength and beauty, between authority and fertility. For years they lived there in relative peace, maintaining religious rituals, ceremonial banquets, and the palace dynamics involving advisors, priestesses, and servants. Sparta's palace, although more modest than Mycenae's, was a center of power with active maritime and diplomatic connections, but that balance was fragile. Helen's beauty, more than a divine gift, was also a curse. Ancient poets often depicted her as someone who never had full control over her fate, driven by forces greater than herself, whether divine or political. Her presence was always a spark. Wherever Helen was, passions ignited, alliances broke, and powerful men lost their reason. Some authors suggest that her marriage to Menelaus was not particularly happy, and that she lived torn between royal duty and a yearning for freedom that could never be fulfilled. Others see her as a tragic figure, manipulated by gods and men, unable to escape the condition of a symbol. When Paris, the Trojan prince, arrived in Sparta, he was received with courtesy. Hospitality was sacred in Greek culture, a ritual called xenia, involving gift exchanges, mutual protection, and absolute respect. Menelaus, trusting in this code of honor and in the presence of protective deities, could never have imagined he was opening the doors of his home to the beginning of his own downfall. When he had to leave Sparta, perhaps on a political or ritual mission, Helen and Paris left together. Whether it was seduction, divine enchantment, or a consensual escape, the fact is that Helen abandoned not only the palace, but the entire network of alliances that upheld Mycenaean peace. She took with her jewels, riches, and above all, Sparta's honor. Menelaus's return and the discovery of the betrayal were devastating. More than a personal offense, Helen's departure was considered an international violation. Hospitality had been betrayed, the suitors' pact was broken, and Menelaus's authority as both man and king had been publicly challenged. The only way to restore his position and redeem his reputation was to demand justice, not just for the stolen wife, but for the entire system of loyalty and honor that sustained the Greek kings. With the unwavering support of Agamemnon, the call to arms went out. Heroes from all over Greece were summoned to fulfill the oath made years before. This was no longer merely a conjugal affair. It was a matter of collective pride, geopolitical stability, and response to public humiliation. Sparta, therefore, was not just the setting for Helen's marriage, but the ground zero from which tragedy began to unfold. The palace where wedding hymns once echoed would soon become a center of military mobilization. Helen, once a symbol of beauty and union, came to be remembered as the one who launched 1,000 ships. In Sparta, Menelaus ceased to be an ordinary king and became a leader driven by vengeance. The city, quiet beneath the hills of the Peloponnese, would forever be remembered not for its walls or its gods, but for being the birthplace of the woman whose departure ignited the greatest mythical war in Western history. The story of Helen's departure alongside Paris, the young Trojan prince, is one of the most debated, reinterpreted, and symbolically loaded episodes of Antiquity. Was Helen in love with him? Was she abducted against her will? Or was she the victim of divine manipulation, used as a piece in a game of Olympian vanity and human conflict? In the more poetic versions, the narrative oscillates between overwhelming desire, the inevitability of fate, and the mystery surrounding the true will of a woman reduced to a symbol. Helen, beautiful beyond the limits of the acceptable, was more than a queen. She was a force that ignited passion, destabilized alliances, and shattered the codes of honor of an entire civilization. The traditional version of Greek mythology, largely shaped by Homer and Euripides, presents an ambiguous portrait. On one hand, Helen is portrayed as a victim of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, who enchanted her as part of the promise made to Paris in the judgment of the Golden Apple. In this version, Paris did not win Helen by his own merit, but was led to her heart through uncontrollable divine forces. The responsibility for her departure, then, lies more with the gods than with the lovers. On the other hand, some accounts suggest that Helen left of her own accord, fascinated by the youth, beauty, and daring of Paris, in contrast to the more austere and mature figure of Menelaus. This version casts Helen as a woman who chooses, who desires, who breaks away from the passive role assigned to women of the time, but also, in the eyes of many, transforms her into a traitor. There are still other, older and less widespread traditions that hint that Helen never reached Troy. Texts attributed to Herodotus I, for example, suggest she was taken to Egypt and that the Trojans fought over an illusion, an image of Helen projected by the gods in Troy, while the real woman was far from it all. These variations reflect the cultural discomfort of accepting that such a long and destructive war could have been caused by a romantic choice, or by a woman. For this reason, reinterpreting Helen's role became a constant exercise in Greek culture, oscillating between exaltation and condemnation. For many, it was more acceptable to believe she was taken by force or enchanted by divine magic than to admit she simply followed her own desire. In the Greek tragedy, Helen, by Euripides, the queen appears as a woman burdened with guilt, but also reflecting deeply on her fate. She questions whether the blame she carries is just, whether her choices were truly free, and whether the men who died in the war perished because of her, or because of a projected idea of who she was. It is one of the first times literature challenges the dominant narrative and offers the character some subjectivity. In other texts, like the Iliad, Helen appears in Troy filled with regret, melancholy, living a daily life of lamentation, aware of the chaos her presence has caused. She does not seem to hate Paris, but neither does she show vibrant passion. She lives a suspended existence, watching the deaths of heroes, enduring the fury of the Spartan queen as the Trojan queen by force. On the other hand, ancient poets were also fascinated by the idea of overwhelming love, one that broke moral boundaries and asserted itself as fate. In this light, the love between Paris and Helen was an expression of the primal forces of human nature: desire, beauty, possessiveness, and transgression. In many painted vases, mosaics, and Greek sculptures, the moment of Helen's abduction is depicted not as a violent kidnapping but as a ceremonial departure. She appears in fine garments, accompanied by servants, walking with Paris toward the Trojan ship. The gesture is not one of resistance, but of crossing. It is transgression in ritual form, a queen crossing the sea, abandoning home, heading toward a destiny that would change the course of human history. It is important to remember that, in Greek tradition, love was rarely just an emotion. It was a living force, embodied in gods like Eros and Aphrodite, and it often led to madness, war, and death. To love someone like Helen was to love something that could not be possessed without destroying the world around it. That is why her figure became so powerful and ambiguous. She represented not only desire, but also the chaos that desire could provoke in a society built upon male honor, blood pacts, and patriarchal control of women's bodies. The abduction, or escape, of Helen is therefore more than a narrative episode. It is the symbol of rupture. The moment alliances shatter, gods divide, men draw their swords, and Troy's fate begins to take shape. From that moment on, beauty becomes a reason for death, and love a reason for destruction. Helen, whether as victim or agent, ceases to be merely a woman and becomes an idea, powerful, destructive, and eternal. When Menelaus returned to Sparta and found the halls silent, the throne empty, and Helen's chambers abandoned, an ancestral fury overtook his soul. The king, betrayed in his own home by a foreigner who had been welcomed under the sacred laws of hospitality, found himself not only in the pain of conjugal loss, but also in a public humiliation that cast him into disgrace before his peers. What was at stake was not merely the love of a woman, it was the honor of a king, the stability of a kingdom, and the violation of an ancient pact. Menelaus understood then that his only path to restoration would be revenge, and that revenge could only be achieved through the total mobilization of the Mycenaean realms. Thus was born the greatest military alliance ever conceived by the Greeks, a pan-Hellenic army, united by ancient oaths, driven by pride, loyalty, and the desire for eternal glory. The pact that allowed this mobilization had been sealed years earlier, when Helen was still just a young princess desired by all the kings of Greece. To prevent a war among suitors, Odysseus had proposed a solemn oath. All would swear to protect the chosen husband, to defend him against any threat, internal or external. At the time it seemed a formality, a gesture of goodwill among nobles. Now it became the legal and moral instrument Menelaus would use to demand the loyalty of the greatest names in Greece. He went immediately to Mycenae, where his brother, Agamemnon, ruled with wealth, authority, and a temper feared and used by the gods. There the two devised the plan to rally all allied kingdoms and launch a punitive expedition against Troy. Agamemnon, though aware of the risks, saw the war as an opportunity. To be the supreme commander of an army bound by oath meant not only avenging his brother's honor, but also consolidating his power over all Greece. He sent messengers to every corner of the Hellenic world, to Ithaca, where Odysseus lived in peace with his wife Penelope and newborn son Telemachus, to Apthia, where Achilles, still a teenager, trained under the watchful eye of the centaur Chiron, to Argos, Pylos, Rhodes, Crete, and dozens of smaller kingdoms. Each was called to fulfill the oath. Many kings hesitated, some out of loyalty, others for political calculation, but the promise made before the gods was inviolable, and refusal would be seen as treason before Olympus and history itself. Assembling the fleet and troops became an epic endeavor. Entire cities emptied of warriors, ships were hastily built, stockpiles of weapons, food, and religious offerings took weeks to prepare. According to tradition, over 1,000 ships gathered at the port of Auliscus in Boeotia, ready to cross the sea toward the Hellespont. It was a colossal logistical effort, impossible for any single kingdom to achieve alone. Therefore, each leader brought his own army, forming a coalition of city-states that had once been isolated, but now stood united under one banner. And with that, the first great movement of Greek unity against a foreign enemy was sealed, a model that would be repeated centuries later against Persians, Romans, and other invaders. The army assembled at Aulis was a parade of heroes destined for legend. There was Achilles, the unmatched warrior, accompanied by his loyal friend, Patroclus, and the Myrmidon soldiers. There was Odysseus, the cleverest of men, reluctant to leave but bound by duty's web. There were Ajax the Great, and his cousin Teucer, an expert archer. There was Diomedes, brave and proud. Each king arrived with his troops, traditions, banners, and local gods, forming a mosaic of cultures that, though all Greek, differed in dialects, customs, and worldviews, but all would obey Agamemnon, named supreme strategist of the expedition. The atmosphere in Aulis, however, soon turned ominous. Opposing winds prevented the fleet's departure for weeks, and a prophetic silence fell upon the sea. Priests consulted the gods and discovered that Artemis, goddess of virgins and the hunt, was offended. Agamemnon, in his arrogance, had either killed a sacred deer of the goddess or boasted of being a better hunter than she. Versions vary, but the result was the same: a cruel demand. For the fleet to sail, he would have to sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia. And so, through tears and silence, the king accepted. Iphigenia was brought to the altar under the pretense of marrying Achilles, but there she was, offered to the gods. Some say Artemis saved her at the last moment and took her far away. Others say her blood soaked the soil of Aulis and released the winds. With the sacrifice made, the ships finally set sail. The sea, once mute, now sang with wood cutting through waves and the shouts of rowers. Greece sailed as one, not for love but for revenge, and on the horizon beyond the waters stood the walls of Troy, tall, golden, and still unaware of the fate approaching like an inevitable storm. Among all the heroes summoned for the war against Troy, none hesitated as intensely as Odysseus, king of Ithaca. Known for his cunning, refined intelligence, and mastery of speech, Odysseus represented a different kind of warrior. He was not the strongest, nor the fastest, but the most shrewd. He had the mind of a strategist, and the heart of a man who understood the consequences of war far beyond glory. When the messengers arrived in Ithaca invoking the oath, Odysseus did not receive the call as a sacred duty, but as a threat to his peaceful life. At that moment, his wife, Penelope Manx, had just given birth to their first son, Telemachus. The king did not want to leave for a war that might last years or even decades, and for that very reason, he attempted the impossible, to escape his own destiny. Odysseus knew the weight of oaths. He himself had proposed the pact that bound all of Helen's former suitors to defend her marriage, regardless of who was chosen. Now, the oath turned against him. But being who he was, he decided to try one last trick. He pretended to be insane. When the Greek envoys arrived in Ithaca, they found him ploughing the fields with a plough drawn by both oxen and donkeys, deliberately mismatched to simulate confusion. Instead of sowing grain, he scattered salt over the earth. He acted as if he recognized no one, muttered incoherent phrases, and kept his eyes blank. It was a calculated performance, and almost convincing. But among the envoys was Palamedes, a nobleman known for his sharp wit and skepticism. Palamedes decided to test the king's madness in a cruel way. He took the infant Telemachus and placed him on the path of the plough. Odysseus halted the animals at the last moment. The ruse had failed. By saving his son, Odysseus revealed that he was sane. Palamedes smiled. Odysseus remained silent. The charade was over. Now there was no turning back. He was bound by the oath, by honor, by the gods, and by the war machine moving eastward. The king of Ithaca, though unwilling, would march to war. But Palamedes' betrayal would not be forgotten. During the years in Troy, Odysseus would plot his revenge, a parallel tale that in itself shows how war not only destroys cities, but also corrupts alliances and sows invisible discord. Unlike heroes such as Achilles or Ajax, Odysseus's figure was always wrapped in ambiguity. He was admired for his intellect, but also feared for his ability to manipulate. Even the gods regarded him with suspicion. Poseidon would come to hate him. Athena, on the other hand, would take him under her protection. In the context of the Trojan War, he would prove essential, not only as a warrior, but as an architect of ideas, advisor in crises, and mastermind behind the most decisive strategies. But at the beginning, he was simply a man who loved his home, who saw in his newborn son a promise of peace, and who, for a moment, tried to flee the relentless gears of sacred oaths. The episode of his feigned madness is more than a curious anecdote. It reveals the psychological dimension of war for the ancient Greeks. While many heroes departed for Troy, driven by the thirst for glory, Odysseus embodied the weight of responsibility, the dilemma between duty and desire, and the ethical struggle in the face of impending destruction. His act of pretending to be insane is, paradoxically, a sign of clarity. He understood what it meant to leave his wife and son. He knew that even a victorious war would exact a terrible price. His hesitation, therefore, echoes what many Greeks likely felt but could not say, that war also meant suffering, loss, and cruel destiny. And yet he went. Like all the other kings of Greece, he set sail with his ships, his soldiers, and his omens. But unlike others who left in pursuit of Kleos and immortal glory, Odysseus departed with the burden of a life he did not want to lose. That tension between the hero and the common man, between the warrior and the father, would become the axis of his entire future journey, and what would make him more than any other the most human character in Greek mythology. When the coalition of Mycenaean kings finally gathered at the port of Naulis, ready to set sail toward the walls of Troy, something unexpected brought the expedition to a halt. The winds, which were supposed to blow eastward, ceased entirely. The sea, once a companion of the ships, became a silent, motionless mirror. No sail moved, no oar dared to cut the water. The army, with thousands of warriors, heroes, and servants, stood still, consuming provisions and feeding unrest. Anxiety grew by the day. Time, in that moment, had become a greater enemy than the Trojans. Faced with this supernatural impasse, the leaders turned to the most respected oracle in the alliance, the priest and seer, Calchas. Calchas was a man feared for his ability to interpret divine signs. He read the skies, the flight of birds, and the livers of sacrificed animals. His word was regarded as the voice of the gods. And when consulted, Calchas revealed a truth that plunged the Greek leaders into an irreversible crisis. Artemis, goddess of the hunt, of virgins, and of silent justice, was furious with Agamemnon. In his arrogance, the king of Mycenae had offended the goddess, either by boasting that he hunted better than her, or by killing a sacred deer in her consecrated grove. The punishment was clear. Artemis had halted the winds, and she would only release them if Agamemnon offered something in return. Not gold, not weapons, not promises, but his daughter, Iphigenia, the purest among all Greek maidens. The revelation fell over the camp like a silent thunderbolt. Sacrificing one's own daughter was more than an act of pain. It was a violation of the deepest bonds of humanity. Agamemnon, king of kings, found himself stripped of all power in the face of divine demand. For days he hesitated. He wept, prayed to the gods, tried to find alternatives, but the winds remained absent, and the men began to lose faith. The war was about to collapse before it even began. Pressured by Menelaus, by his generals, and by Calchas himself, Agamemnon made the hardest decision of his life. He sent messengers to Mycenae, requesting that his wife, Clytemnestra, send Iphigenia to Aulis under the pretense that she would marry the hero, Achilles, an honor reserved for the noblest of young women. Clytemnestra, trusting, prepared her daughter for the ceremony. Iphigenia arrived in Aulis dressed in white, smiling, surrounded by handmaidens and adorned in wedding veils. Achilles, upon learning of the deceit, was outraged. He refused to let his name be used for such trickery and threatened to protect the girl, but it was too late. The preparations for the sacrifice were already underway. The young girl, upon understanding her fate, according to some versions, accepted it with courage, saying she preferred to die rather than hinder Greece's victory. In others, she cried, pleaded, and was dragged to the altar. In both, the scene became a symbol of horror and moral collapse. At the appointed time, Iphigenia was led to the sacred altar, surrounded by priests, warriors, and Agamemnon himself, his eyes full of tears. Calchas raised the knife. Some accounts say that at the last moment, Artemis, moved, replaced the girl with a deer and took Iphigenia to a hidden sanctuary. Others claim the blade fell upon the girl's neck, and her blood purified the winds. Either way, after the ritual, the sea breathed again. The sails of the ships filled with firm breezes, and the thousands of boats began to move eastward, carrying not only spears and shields, but also the stain of a sacred crime. This episode is one of the most tragic and somber moments in all Greek mythological tradition. It marks the transition between preparation and conflict, between human order and the irrationality of fate. The sacrifice of Iphigenia reveals how far a leader might go in the name of collective honor, military glory, and the fulfillment of divine decrees. It also reveals the gods' cruel nature, who demand the unthinkable from mortals as a price for their favor. Agamemnon, who was supposed to symbolize power and leadership, becomes in this moment a man shattered by obedience. The army itself, silent before the altar, becomes complicit in an act that would stain every day of the war that followed. The memory of Iphigenia would follow Agamemnon until the war's end, and beyond. In his absence, Clytemnestra, devastated by her daughter's death and betrayed by her husband, would vow revenge. Thus, the Trojan War had already begun with innocent blood spilled by the Greeks themselves, with internal fractures that would grow through every battle. The sacrifice did not unify. It merely pushed the army forward, like a body moving by inertia, trying to ignore the weight of guilt buried in the altars that were meant to bless the war. With the winds finally released by the gods after the sacrifice of Iphigenia, the gigantic Greek fleet, composed of over 1,000 ships, departed from the port of Aulis toward the east. It was a grand and unsettling sight, white sails in the distance forming a living line across the Aegean Sea, the sound of war drums echoing over the waves, and the sense that the fate of Greece was sailing across those waters, carried by hundreds of thousands of men. Each ship transported warriors, provisions, weapons, and priests. On deck, heroes from all over Hellas stared at the uncertain horizon, while the gods watched them from above, divided between sympathy, rivalry, and indifference. The crossing to Troy would not be merely a geographic journey. It would be a plunge into a destiny shaped by omens, storms, and invisible forces. From the very first days of navigation, signs began to accumulate. Ancient accounts describe a heavy atmosphere, stars shining with unusual intensity, birds circling the ships, and nights in which the silence of the sea was interrupted by strange whispers coming from the mist. Priests were constantly consulted, and sacrifices were performed aboard the vessels in an attempt to appease the sea gods and ensure a safe crossing. Fish, doves, and even small goats were cast into the waters as offerings to Poseidon, lord of the seas, and to Leucothea, the goddess who protects castaways. But offerings were not enough. The sea also demanded fear and silence. Those who dared to boast about the mission or mock divine signs were soon silenced by sudden misfortunes. At one point, one of the most violent storms ever recorded struck the fleet. Lightning tore across the skies, ships were dragged by unknown currents, and many lost sight of one another. Some sank, others landed on unknown islands, such as the mythical Mysia, where they fought peoples they mistook for Trojans. In one of these hasty conflicts, the hero Achilles was killed King Telephus, a death that would later become an obstacle, since only Achilles himself could heal the wound with his spear, a paradox reinforcing the cyclical game between war and redemption. On other vessels, such as those of Odysseus, sailors were carried by currents to unknown shores and had to survive with the help of natives, performing new sacrifices to find their way back to the fleet. These interruptions fragmented the expedition for weeks. The war had not yet begun, but the gods were already testing the Greeks' alliance. There was hunger on some ships, outbreaks of fever on others, and rumors that Troy was protected by powerful enchantments. Some men, seeing the signs, wanted to return home, but the pact, honor, and Agamemnon's vigilant eyes kept everyone under control. The silence when ships reunited on open sea was more eloquent than shouts. It was the silence of an army already aware that the war would not be glorious, but drawn out, divine, and tragic. When the coast of Asia Minor finally emerged on the horizon, all eyes turned toward the mountainous interior where, beyond the plains, the walls of Troy rose. A golden city, high and impregnable, surrounded by cultivated fields and protected by powerful allies. The ships began to anchor along the coast, forming a massive encampment on the white sand beaches. Tents, altars, palisades, and improvised towers rose, a new world being born before the city they came to destroy. The Greeks, now organized under Agamemnon's command, erected a makeshift temple to Zeus and celebrated their arrival with new rituals, sacrifices, and vows of victory. But behind the ceremonies, there was tension. Troy was more formidable than expected. Its walls seemed to touch the sky, and its army, led by Priam, Hector, and Paris, was ready. The crossing to Troy, therefore, was not just a physical journey. It was a spiritual and symbolic transformation. The heroes ceased to be men and became pawns of fate. The gods had already shown they would intervene at will, and nature, storms, plagues, accidents, served as their instrument. The war that awaited would not be decided by spears and shields alone, but by signs, dreams, and the whims of greater forces. The beach of Troy, where they now camped, would be the stage for 10 years of suffering, glory, and irretrievable losses. The journey had ended, but the true path, the one toward immortality or destruction, had just begun. After weeks of crossing, misdirection, and storms, the Greek fleet finally anchored off the coast of Asia Minor, near the mouth of the Scamander River, before the imposing walls of the legendary city of Troy. What was being formed there was not merely a camp. It was a provisional city made of tents, improvised walls, and altars, where priests sacrificed animals to appease the gods. The beach of Troy became the new home for thousands of men, kings, and warriors who had no idea how many days, months, or years they would remain on that foreign soil. Before them, the Trojan city stood silent and solid, seemingly unfazed by the arrival of the greatest military force ever assembled by the Greeks. The war, which many expected to be brief, began with hesitation, skirmishes, and a tension that grew with each dawn. The first attempt at a direct assault was not against Troy itself, but against its allied cities. The Greeks understood that a frontal siege against such high and fortified walls would be suicidal. Instead, they chose to gradually isolate Troy, raiding nearby villages, cutting off trade routes, and destroying surrounding agricultural and religious centers. These actions aimed to weaken the Trojan economy and lure their armies out of the walls. Troy itself, protected by its strategic geography, built on a hill with multi-layered fortifications and internal water sources, resisted with tactical passivity. Priam, the elderly king, refused to be provoked. His sons, Hector, the most noble and brave, and Paris, the cause of the conflict, observed the enemy's movements with caution. The Trojans remained inside the city, preparing for a long war. The first battles took place outside the walls. The Greeks, led by heroes like Achilles, Ajax, Diomedes, and Odysseus, invaded peripheral territories, plundering and enslaving Troy's allies. These incursions not only fed the army with resources and captives, but also provided war prizes to the commanders. It was during one of these campaigns that Achilles took Briseis, a Trojan woman of noble lineage, who would later become central to a devastating internal conflict between him and Agamemnon. Another captured figure was Chryseis, daughter of a priest of Apollo given to Agamemnon. His refusal to return her would ignite the wrath of the god, who would unleash a plague upon the Greek camps, though this tension would unfold later. Meanwhile, the Greek encampment transformed into a permanent military structure. There were designated sectors for each contingent: the Myrmidons of Achilles, the Achaeans of Agamemnon, the Aetolians of Diomedes, the Ithacans of Odysseus, each with its central tent, altar, and armory. These were like small city-states coexisting side by side under a common command, but with latent rivalries. Prolonged coexistence began to generate friction, disputes over spoils, recognition, leadership, and even differing views on the gods and rituals. The unity formed at Aulis began to fragment on the sands of Troy. Contrary to expectations, the war was not quick. Troy endured, and the days, weeks, and months turned into years. The besieged city continued to resupply, receiving support through northern and eastern routes, and maintaining high morale thanks to constant allies like the Lycians, led by Sarpedon and the Amazons, who would later appear as legendary reinforcements. The presence of women in the city, such as Andromache, Hector's wife, and Cassandra, the cursed prophetess who saw the future but was never believed, showed that Troy resisted not only militarily, but spiritually as well. The walls, said to have been built by gods like Apollo and Poseidon, remained impenetrable. The Greeks, in turn, found themselves trapped in a never-ending war, and the beach became a ceremonial prison, where each day brought more losses than victories. The initial siege revealed that the war against Troy would not be won by brute force. It was a war of endurance, of faith, of gods who chose sides and changed their minds, of fragile alliances and inflated egos. Time, more than any army, would be the Greeks' true enemy. Those who came seeking glory now faced boredom, disease, and the weight of absence. The dice had been cast, and the war, which was supposed to be vengeance for a woman, turned into a spiral of pride, blood, and madness. The siege was in place, but Troy still breathed, and in the silence between skirmishes the gods decided, between laughter and wagers, the fate of every man on that sacred shore. With the failure of the initial assaults on the Trojan walls, the war turned into a prolonged siege, and the first 9 years of the conflict were marked not by direct attacks on the city of Troy, but by a slow and methodical war of attrition. The Greeks, aware that their forces were insufficient to conquer Troy by force, adopted a strategy of indirect weakening, devastating the allied towns and villages in the surrounding region. These peripheral campaigns not only fed the army with resources, but also ensured individual glory for the Mycenaean heroes through conquests, plunder, and the capture of prisoners. It was a violent war of expansion, of cycles of victory and stagnation, in which each battle revealed not only human strength, but also the internal fractures that threatened to undermine the alliance of kings. During these years, Achilles stood out as the greatest warrior of the Greek army. With his Myrmidons, he devastated dozens of cities near Troy, winning single combats, taking noble hostages, and accumulating unmatched prestige. His name became synonymous with invincibility, and his presence on the battlefield was terror to his enemies. But this individual brilliance also stirred resentment. Agamemnon, the supreme commander, felt challenged. The proud king of Mycenae could not bear to see another man exalted as the true pillar of the campaign. Thus a silent rivalry arose between them, made of glances, omissions, and veiled insults. Other kings such as Ajax, Odysseus, and Diomedes also competed for recognition, promised lands, and control of the spoils, and this competitive environment began to erode Greek unity. Internal politics within the camp became as important as the war itself. Every victory had to be celebrated with rituals, offerings, and the division of loot. Captured women, such as Troy, Briseis, and Achilles Chryseis, became symbols of prestige and personal trophies for the leaders. It was precisely because of Briseis that one of the greatest crises of the conflict erupted. Agamemnon, forced to return his captive Chryseis after provoking the wrath of the god Apollo and causing a devastating plague in the camp, decided to take Briseis from Achilles as compensation. This was not just a matter of trading captives, it was a public humiliation. Achilles, wounded in pride, withdrew from the war and refused to fight. Without its greatest warrior, the Greek army lost morale, strategy, and offensive power. Achilles' absence was felt as a void on the battlefield and as an open wound in the Achaean leadership. While the Greeks faced internal disputes, the Trojans took the opportunity to strengthen their defenses. Hector, the Trojan prince, organized the city's armies, trained young warriors, and forged alliances with other kingdoms of Asia Minor. Troy received periodic reinforcements, among them Sarpedon, Glaucus, and even the Ethiopian Memnon, all drawn by the honor of fighting against the Greeks and the promise of defending a just city. The walls remained intact. The city resisted not only with stone and iron, but with strategy, faith, and internal unity. The presence of women such as Cassandra, the prophetess who saw the end clearly but was never believed, and as Andromache, Hector's wife and a symbol of Trojan feminine dignity, morally sustained the city during moments of siege, famine, and uncertainty. Daily life in the Greek camp became repetitive. Every night was marked by banquets, libations, and arguments among the kings. Sacrifices to the gods continued, but the omens grew darker. Time seemed to spin in circles, and psychological fatigue accumulated. Many soldiers began to fall ill, others attempted to desert, and some even took their own lives. The war, which was meant to be a glorious act of revenge, had become a prolonged and cruel burden. Even so, the kings remained, bound by oath, pride, and the promise of a victory that year after year seemed ever more distant. The gods in turn continued to intervene whimsically. Athena protected the Greeks, Apollo punished them, Aphrodite protected Paris and Helen, while Zeus watched from afar, calculating each imbalance with the coldness of a divine judge. During those 9 years, neither side won, but both lost. The Greeks, stuck on the sand, watched their youth slip away amid futile battles and disputes for honor. The Trojans, besieged, lived with the constant shadow of destruction. It was as if time had frozen both worlds in an endless cycle of pain and glory. But something was about to break that balance. Achilles' absence on the battlefield would give way to irreversible events. The war, until then restrained by sieges and skirmishes, was about to explode in full force, and when it did, neither gods nor men would be able to stop what was to come. In the midst of the 9th year of war, when physical and moral exhaustion already dominated the Greek camp, an internal conflict became more decisive than any battle against the Trojans. This conflict did not occur on the walls of Troy, but in the hearts of the Achaean leaders themselves, and it was ignited by a dispute over honor, ego, and pride. Achilles, son of Peleus and the goddess Thetis, was the most powerful of the Greek warriors. His name had already become synonymous with invincibility, and his victories in Trojan-allied cities surpassed those of any other commander. He was feared, respected, and fully aware of his own importance. However, he was also young, impulsive, and driven by a sensitivity bordering on ferocity. When Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and supreme commander of the coalition, decided to take the slave woman Briseis from him, the offense went far beyond the value of any woman. It was a direct attack on the hero's identity, honor, and status in front of all the kings of Greece. Briseis was not just a war prize. She was a noblewoman captured by Achilles during the sack of the city of Lyrnessus, and with whom he had developed deep emotional ties. Some texts suggest that he loved her, others that he saw her as a symbol of personal victory. But in either case, she represented more than a trophy. She was part of his narrative of glory. When Chryseis, Agamemnon's slave, was demanded back by her father, a priest of Apollo, Agamemnon refused, provoking the god's wrath. A violent plague devastated the Greek camp, and Calchas the seer revealed that the only way to stop it was to return Chryseis. Under pressure, Agamemnon relented, but not without asserting dominance. In return, he demanded Briseis from Achilles, taking her as compensation. That gesture was the spark that ignited Achilles' pride. Agamemnon's action was not only humiliating, but politically devastating. Publicly, the greatest warrior of Greece had been overruled, exposed, and stripped of his prize by a man who, though commander, would never dare face him on the battlefield. Achilles, in front of all, did not respond with immediate violence, as one might expect from a demigod consumed by rage, but with something even more impactful. He withdrew to his tent and refused to fight. It was his form of revenge. Achilles' absence from the battlefield brutally weakened the Greeks. Without him, the Trojans advanced with confidence. Hector, the noblest of Priam's sons, led bold attacks that pushed the Greeks back to the shoreline. During this period of withdrawal, Achilles plunged into a fierce silence. He isolated himself from the other kings, rejected all attempts at reconciliation, and surrendered to a quiet fury fueled by wounded pride and a sense of betrayal. His mother, Thetis, came to him from the sea and promised that the gods would make the Greeks feel his absence. She then went to Zeus, lord of Olympus, and begged him to favor the Trojans temporarily, just so the Achaeans would understand what it meant to insult her son. Zeus, persuaded, granted the request, and the divine balance that sustained the war began to tip. With the gods' aid, the Trojans forced the Greeks to retreat to their ships, destroyed part of the camp, and reignited the fear of imminent defeat. Achilles' absence exposed all the weaknesses of the Greek army. Agamemnon, though powerful, was no strategist. Ajax fought bravely but lacked cunning. Odysseus tried to contain internal divisions, but morale was shaken. Meanwhile, the Trojans, now driven by Hector's courage and Apollo's blessings, advanced with a strength they had not shown in years. Troy's walls remained intact, and the Greeks, trapped in the sand, saw their ships threatened, their leadership divided, and their hope fading. The wrath of Achilles, as would be immortalized by Homer in the very first verse of the Iliad, was not merely an outburst of anger. It was a movement that shifted the course of the war, revealed the fragility of alliances, and foretold even greater tragedies. At the heart of the story was not only the conflict between Greeks and Trojans, but between proud men, fickle gods, and intense human emotions. Honor, love, envy, resentment, and silence became weapons as powerful as spears and shields, and Achilles' absence from the battlefield, more than his presence, now became the gravitational center of the war. The hero was alive, but his shadow loomed over all, and the Greek world would never be the same again. The absence of Achilles on the battlefield dragged on like a silent curse. The Greek camp, once vibrant with the sounds of victory, now sank into tension and despair. The Trojan forces, led by Hector, advanced day after day, pushing the trenches all the way to the Greek ships. The ports were no longer safe, the command tents trembled at the sound of enemy footsteps, and the allied armies, though numerous, were morally shattered. The war had ceased to be a pursuit of glory and honor. It had become a count of corpses and failures, and it was in this collapsing scenario that the figure of young Patroclus Comadon emerged, a man who had never sought glory for himself, but who quietly carried the fire of friendship, sacrifice, and the tragedy that would forever change the course of the war. Patroclus, cousin and inseparable companion of Achilles, was more than just a squire. Raised together from youth, they shared a bond that transcended blood or duty. Some poets portrayed them as spiritual brothers, others as lovers, but all agreed. Between them existed a profound, unbreakable connection that resisted time, war, and pride. Patroclus was older, calmer, less impulsive. While Achilles burned in wrath, Patroclus walked among the warriors, listening, observing, trying to ease the growing pain among the Achaeans, and it was precisely that compassion that led him to his fate. Seeing the army crumble, he begged Achilles to at least wear his armor, so that upon seeing his gleaming figure in the field, the Greeks would regain their courage, and the Trojans would tremble in fear, believing Achilles had returned. Achilles, reluctant, agreed. He set one condition: Patroclus could fight only to drive the Trojans away from the ships, but should not pursue them beyond the safe lines. Achilles' armor, forged by Hephaestus with sacred metals and ancient enchantments, gleamed like the sun. When Patroclus entered the battle, the war cries echoed across the plains. The Trojans, confused, began to retreat. The Greeks, reinvigorated, advanced with renewed fury. Patroclus fought with a bravery that astonished even the gods. He killed Sarpedon, son of Zeus and prince of Lycia, in a fierce battle, and Zeus himself, watching the scene, had his heart torn, but did not intervene. It was fate speaking. Encouraged by victory, Patroclus forgot Achilles' warning. He advanced beyond the enemy lines, reaching the walls of Troy. There, at the heart of enemy territory, he encountered Hector. The battle between them was intense but unequal. Hector, experienced and blessed by Apollo, had divine aid. Apollo intervened, disarmed Patroclus with an invisible blow, and Hector, unaware it was another man beneath Achilles' armor, struck the fatal blow. With Patroclus's death, the battlefield fell silent. But before dying, the young hero uttered a curse that Hector would die soon after, at the hands of Achilles. The news of Patroclus's death reached Achilles like a poisoned arrow to the heart. The hero, who had resisted the pleas of kings, battles, and even the gods, collapsed to the ground, covered himself in ashes, tore his garments, and wept like never before. His grief was not just for the loss of a friend, it was the loss of himself. Patroclus was his anchor, his memory, his humanity. Without him, Achilles became only wrath, fire, and destruction. He cried out for vengeance. But first, he needed new armor, for his had been taken by Hector as a trophy. Then Thetis, his mother, climbed to Olympus and begged the divine smith Hephaestus to forge a new armor, unique, powerful, enough to make even the immortals tremble. The armor forged by Hephaestus was a divine masterpiece. Its shield, in particular, was a microcosm of the world. It depicted cities in peace and war, harvests, weddings, trials, stars, and oceans. It was the entire universe in the hands of a man consumed by fury. Achilles, now reborn in bronze and fire, would return to the battlefield, but not as the hero of old. Patroclus had died, and with him died the last thread of tenderness in the warrior's heart. What would come next would not be battle, it would be annihilation. The river Scamander itself would try to stop him. The gods would gather to contain his advance, but nothing would prevent the reunion of Achilles and Hector. The Greek tragedy was in motion, and the eyes of the world, mortal and immortal, were fixed on the storm that approached. With the death of Patroclus, the world of Achilles turned to ashes. The hero who once fought for glory now existed only to avenge. His pain was not silent. It was a raging fire capable of incinerating everything around him. After receiving the new armor forged by Hephaestus, gleaming like the sun, and blessed by the gods themselves, Achilles returned to the battlefield, but not as before. The man once praised as the most beautiful, the swiftest, the most invincible, was now feared as a god of death. His entrance into the battlefield caused terror. The Trojan lines broke apart as if a storm had descended upon them. No tactic, no warrior, no spell could stop him. Achilles had not come to fight. He had come to kill. With his return, the Greeks regained their breath. But Achilles' true target was Hector, Prince of Troy, heir of Priam, commander of the Trojan forces, and killer of Patroclus. Hector had been the only warrior able to face the Greeks with balance, honor, and intelligence. He was not driven by vanity or conquest, but by the duty to protect his city, his family, and his people. His noble character made him the opposite mirror of Achilles, less swift but more stable, less wrathful but more self-aware. And still, he knew he could not escape his fate. In one of the most human scenes of the Iliad, Hector bids farewell to his wife, Andromache, and his son, Astyanax, knowing he likely would not return alive. His premonition was clear. The end was near. The battle between Achilles and Hector became the emotional and symbolic climax of the entire war. Hector, seeing Achilles approach like a gleaming bronze shadow, first hesitates. He feels the urge to flee, and does. 3 times he circles the walls of Troy, with Achilles in pursuit, like a predator chasing its prey. The gods watch in silence. Zeus, moved by Hector's bravery, weighs his soul on the scales of fate, and there the balance falls. Hector's fate was sealed. Finally, tricked by Athena, who takes the form of his brother and convinces him to stop, Hector turns to fight. They face each other, 2 unequal forces. Hector fights bravely, but Achilles is beyond human rage. The Trojan spear fails. Achilles finds the opening in the armor, pierces the neck, and Hector falls. What follows is one of the most brutal scenes in all ancient literature. Hector, still dying, begs for a gesture of humanity. He asks that his body be returned to his family so he may receive a proper funeral. But Achilles, blinded by rage, refuses. He declares that the body will be left to dogs and scavenging birds. As the ultimate insult, Achilles ties Hector's body by the heels to his war chariot and drags it around the walls of Troy in full view of his people, his father, Priam, and his desperate wife. It was more than vengeance. It was an assault on every sacred value of honor, respect for the dead, and the moral balance of war. The gods themselves are outraged. Apollo protects Hector's body from decay, and Zeus demands that Achilles return the corpse. Then unfolds one of the most moving scenes in the epic tradition. Priam, the old king of Troy, overcome with grief, travels to the Greek camp, guided by Hermes through the night, and kneels before his enemy. The man who had lost everything, the sovereign who had watched his people suffer, kisses the hands of the man who killed his son, and begs. He reminds Achilles of his own father, of how both were old, alone, and held hostage by sorrow. And in that moment, Achilles breaks. For the first time since Patroclus' death, he weeps. In Priam, he sees Peleus. In the lament, he hears himself. The furious hero yields to the man. He returns Hector's body, grants a 12-day truce for the funerals, and allows Troy to mourn its prince. With Hector's death, Troy lost its greatest defender. The city, which had resisted for 9 years, now found itself orphaned of its human shield. Achilles, for his part, reached the apex of his arc. He avenged his friend, destroyed his enemy, and regained a trace of humanity. But the cycle was not yet complete. Thetis had warned him from the beginning. By killing Hector, he would seal his own death, and that fate would not delay. His name would live forever in the songs of poets, but his body would soon join the countless others scattered across the Trojan shore. The climax had arrived, and the end was beginning to take shape on the horizon. In the silence that followed Hector's fall, the city of Troy sank into a deeper shadow than any military threat had ever cast. For the first time in nearly a decade of siege, the Trojans mourned not a fallen wall or a looted temple, but the loss of the very heart of their resistance. Hector was not just Troy's greatest warrior. He was its hope, its protector, its moral compass amid chaos. His death at the hands of Achilles was not merely a strategic defeat. It was the symbol of the beginning of the end. And the outrage against his body, mercilessly dragged through the sand before the very walls where his wife and father watched helplessly, was an open wound in the soul of all. Yet no grief compared to that of Priam, the old king, who now saw his noblest son treated as spoils of war. Priam was already a man marked by tragedy. Father to 50 sons, many of whom had died during the siege, His reign had been steadily eroded by the destruction of his lands, his allies, and his peace. But to lose Hector, his eldest son, his rightful heir, his pillar of dignity and bravery, was beyond words. The Trojan elders saw him wander the city squares without speaking, without eating, his gaze lost among towers that now seemed useless. For 11 days Hector's body remained in Greek possession. Though protected by the gods from decay, his fate hung between mortal rage and immortal compassion. Olympus stirred with debate. Apollo accused the others of favoring Achilles too much. Zeus, moved by the injustice of it all, summoned Thetis, and ordered that her son return the body, not by force, but by humanity. Then, in one of the most magnificent gestures in mythology, Priam decided to go alone to the enemy camp. Guided by the god Hermes, on a silent night, he passed through the gates of his city, walked past sleeping sentries, and arrived at Achilles' tent. There, before the man who had killed his son, he knelt. He kissed the hands of the killer. He begged not as a king, but as a father. His words echoed with the power of 1,000 battles. He spoke of Peleus Moor, Achilles' father, of the old age they both shared, of the sorrow that united them. He did not ask for justice, he asked for mercy. He said he only wanted to bury his son with honor, to close his mourning by looking into the eyes of the man who had taken everything from him. It was the most naked gesture of humanity in the face of barbarity, compassion pleading for a place amid fury. Achilles, caught off guard, felt the walls of his rage begin to crumble. The man who had become a killing machine now faced the image of his own father in a weary enemy. Priam's tears opened a path for his own. For the first time since Patroclus' death, Achilles wept again, not for his loss, but for another's pain. He accepted the plea. He vowed to cease combat for 12 days, so Troy could hold funeral rites. He ordered Hector's body washed, wrapped in fine linens, anointed with oils and perfumes, and returned it to Priam with reverence. A ceremonial silence enveloped the camp as the old king returned to his city, carrying the body of his most beloved son, now wrapped not in blood, but in restored dignity. Hector's funeral was among the most solemn Troy had ever witnessed. Thousands of Trojans followed the funeral pyre. Women tore their garments in mourning. Andromache, his widow, Hecuba, his mother, and even Helen, the woman whose flight had started it all, wept over his body. For days, Troy silenced its weapons and surrendered to grief. It was a pause between two storms. Hector's death marked the last organized resistance of the city. King Priam, though dignified, no longer had the strength to lead battles. Paris, the cause of the war, still lived, but he did not command the same respect. And on the horizon, fate continued to move with the same inevitability that had brought Achilles back to the battlefield. Priam's gesture, the man who kissed the hands of his son's killer, became an eternal symbol of the power of forgiveness. Amid the brutality of war, it is the moment when epic becomes human, when fury yields to the recognition of another's pain. For the ancient Greeks, this scene was not only moving, it was a lesson. It showed that even at the height of tragedy, there remained space for empathy. But the pause would be brief. The war was not over. Achilles' shadow still loomed over the field, and fate, as relentless as ever, prepared the final twists of a story, written in blood, honor, and silence. Amid the spears, shields, plagues, deaths, and laments that marked the Trojan War, there existed an invisible and absolute dimension that governed, distorted, and amplified every event: the will of the gods. More than distant observers, the gods of Olympus were active protagonists of the war. They chose sides, protected heroes, caused disasters, and quarreled among themselves like envious siblings entangled in a tragic and sublime game. For the ancient Greeks, the war between Greeks and Trojans was not merely a human conflict. It was the earthly manifestation of a divine feud that began with the judgment of the golden apple. The conflict, therefore, could not be understood purely in strategic or human terms. It was a celestial war, staged in the realm of mortals, where fate, honor, and suffering were subject to the whims and alliances of immortal gods. Above all, Zeus, king of the gods, remained a central and ambiguous figure. His role was to regulate cosmic balance. He did not take sides openly, but interfered strategically when fate required equilibrium. He was the one who granted Thetis's request to favor the Trojans after Achilles' humiliation, and he was also the one who authorized Athena to deceive Hector, sealing his fate. Zeus was not driven by morality, but by a superior, distant, almost mathematical logic, the preservation of destiny. His scale was sacred. When he weighed Hector's life and the scale tipped downward, there was no more hope. He did not prevent death, he simply organized it. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, was the Greeks' main ally. Ever since the judgment of Paris, she felt insulted by the choice of Aphrodite, who received the golden apple. Her support of Odysseus, Diomedes, and Achilles was constant. In battle, she protected warriors, deflected spears, and whispered advice in their ears. She was the one who gave Odysseus his cunning, who guided Ajax's hands, and who kept the camp united even when men began to question their purpose. Athena also manipulated enemies. It was in her guise that Hector's brother appeared to falsely encourage him to face Achilles. She felt no pity, only purpose. To Athena, war was a chessboard, and men were pieces moved by her divine logic. Apollo, god of the sun, the arts, and plagues, was the most devoted defender of the Trojans. From the earliest days of the war, he protected Paris, who, with a bow guided by Apollo, would mortally wound Achilles in the heel, and unleashed plagues upon the Greeks when Agamemnon insulted his priest. Apollo was the opposite of Athena. He did not seek strategy but ritual justice. When sacred pacts were broken, he responded with plagues and punishments. The death of Sarpedon, his mortal son, at the hands of Patroclus, led him to intervene with renewed fury. Apollo disarmed Patroclus, clearing the path for his death, and shielded Troy in divine light until destiny required its fall. His acts were direct, brilliant, lethal. Other gods intervened as well. Aphrodite, protector of Paris and Helen, saved the prince on more than one occasion, shrouding him in clouds and removing him from battle. Her love was not strategic, it was possessive. She fought for beauty, desire, and domination of the senses. Poseidon, lord of the seas, swayed between supporting the Greeks due to past Trojan offenses and asserting his power for the sake of balance. Hera, wife of Zeus, hated Troy fiercely, allying with Athena in various secret interventions. Even Mars, god of raw and brutal war, shifted sides, acting less as a protector and more as a chaotic force that inflamed combat. On the battlefield, the divine presence was constant. Warriors often felt a god behind them. Spears deflected on their own, thunder struck with no clouds in sight, and winds changed direction mid-shout. The gods disguised themselves as humans, whispered advice, stirred confusion in enemy lines, or simply delighted in the suffering they had inspired. For the Greeks, this was natural. The gods were not perfect nor just. They were eternal, yes, but also jealous, vain, needy, wrathful, and unpredictable. And that capricious nature made the Trojan War not a fair contest, but a theater of eternal passions, performed by gods thirsty for worship and mortals thirsty for meaning. By understanding the role of the gods in the war, we realize that no hero was truly in control of their fate. Achilles only returned to battle because Thetis intervened. Patroclus died because Apollo intervened. Hector died because Athena deceived him. Even the wooden horse that would seal Troy's fall was an idea inspired by divine cunning. The Trojan War was the mirror in which the gods looked and saw themselves, vain, vengeful, loving, destructive. And men, no matter how brave or just, were at the mercy of those forces, doomed to fight, love, and die beneath the shadow of those who never die. In the vastness of suffering that engulfed the Trojan War, few voices were more silenced, more ignored, and more devastated than those of the Trojan women. While heroes fell in glory on the battlefield, while gods vied for vanity on Olympus, the women of Troy experienced the conflict on another plane, that of the silent mourning, futile waiting, and inevitable destruction. They did not wield spears, but upheld the human pillars of the city. They did not enter the walls to fight, but endured within them the fear, the loss, and the prophecy. Andromache, Hecuba, and Cassandra were not merely secondary characters. They were sentinels of the end, witnesses to the ruin, and to the cruel weight that war imposes on those who have no choice. Andromache, wife of Hector and mother of Aeneas, embodied the tragic ideal of the devoted wife. Her life was devoted to her home, to raising her son, to maintaining dignity in dark times. But that fragile peace crumbled when Hector was slain by Achilles. The scene in which Andromache discovers her husband's death is one of the most heart-wrenching in the Iliad. She runs through the palace halls, hears the cries, sees the body brought in, and collapses under the weight of fate. Yet her pain does not end there. She knew that with her husband's fall, her son, direct heir to the royal house, was also marked. And indeed, after Troy's fall, Astyanax would be thrown from the city walls by the Greeks, a brutal act to prevent any future claim or resistance. Andromache, reduced to a slave, would be taken to the palace of Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, where she would live as a captive of the man who destroyed her family. Hecuba, the queen mother, wife of Priam, was the feminine heart of the city. Throughout the war, she was the voice that consoled, advised, preserved the rights, kept the gods close, and pleaded for the reason the gods never granted. She saw her sons die one by one. First, Polydorus, then Troilus, then Hector. She saw her daughters promised in marriage and later abducted, and when Troy finally fell, she witnessed Priam himself being murdered before Zeus's altar, mercilessly, by Neoptolemus. Hecuba became a prisoner, a slave to the enemies, and in some versions she went mad in the face of utter loss. Other accounts say that, upon seeing her son Polydorus's body devoured by dogs, she turned into a dog, the ultimate symbol of dehumanization. Whichever the version, her figure stands as the archetype of a mother shattered by war, a queen turned into a shadow, dignity reduced to dust. And then we have Cassandra, the prophetic daughter, cursed by Apollo. Loved by the god and then rejected by him, she was condemned to see the future with absolute clarity, but never to be believed. Cassandra foresaw the fall of Troy from the beginning. She warned about the judgment of the apple, about Helen's flight, about the arrival of the Greeks, about the wooden horse trap, but no one listened. Her cries were deemed madness, her warnings delusions. She was a woman who carried the truth and was treated as a liar. When Troy was sacked, Cassandra sought refuge in Athena's temple, clinging to the altar, but not even the gods protected her. Ajax the Lesser violated her there, committing one of the war's most heinous sacrileges. After the city's fall, Cassandra was given as war prize to Agamemnon, who took her to Mycenae, where she foresaw and could not prevent her own murder at the hands of Clytemnestra, the betrayed and vengeful wife. These women, each in their own way, represent the three stages of collapse: the wife who loses husband and child, the mother who sees her lineage extinguished, and the daughter who foresees horror and is ignored. Together, they form the deepest and most lasting image of war, the one not built on spilled blood in battle, but on the silent pain of those who survive. Their fates show that the glory sung by bards comes at the cost of silenced voices, erased lives, and stories rarely told. In later tragic tradition, authors such as Euripides gave voice to these female figures in works like The Trojan Women, where, seated among the city's ruins, Hecuba, Andromache, Cassandra, and Helen discuss the meaning of suffering, the responsibility of the gods, the banality of glory, and the emptiness of vengeance. In those versions, heroes become fleeting shadows, and the stage is left to the women who remain, weep, curse, and rebuild their fates from the scraps left behind. The Trojan War, then, was not only a war of men, it was also, and perhaps above all, a war of the women who lived it in silence. They did not enter the Iliad as warriors, but left the story as the eternal echo of what war destroys when glory fades. Among the final flickers of resistance in the city of Troy, when hope had turned into memory, and the gods seemed to retreat to their marble and mist-filled palaces, an unexpected figure emerged, one who belonged neither to the Trojans nor the Achaeans: Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons. She came from distant lands, riding with her warrior sisters, crossing mountains and rivers to fight alongside Troy. Her arrival momentarily shattered the war's linear narrative. It was as if legend had stepped into flesh and blood on the battlefield. The Amazons, warrior women who lived on the fringes of the male world, were summoned by Priam as a last resort, and their presence rekindled the spirit of a city teetering on the edge of collapse. Penthesilea was no ordinary warrior. Daughter of Ares, the god of war, and Queen Otrera, she was raised for battle, not for marriage or motherhood. In legend, the Amazons lived in regions near the Caucasus or northern Asia Minor, in matriarchal societies where men did not command armies or councils. Penthesilea's arrival in Troy was met with reverence and surprise. Beautiful, proud, armed with a crescent-shaped shield and a spear, she inspired awe, but she also carried a terrible burden, the guilt of having accidentally killed her sister Hippolyta during a hunt. She sought redemption and saw in the Trojan War a chance to die with honor. The Amazons did not come to observe. As soon as they entered the battlefield, they shocked the Greeks. The female troops, riding swift horses and wielding bows and spears, fought with precision and ferocity. It was not just courage, it was skill, tradition, a unique style of warfare that defied Mycenaean norms. For days they fought alongside the Trojans, injuring countless Greek soldiers and delaying the final assault. Penthesilea stood out in particular, engaging in singular duels and facing seasoned warriors without hesitation. It was as if Ares himself had sent his daughter to prove that war belonged to those who understood it, regardless of gender. But Penthesilea's legend reaches its peak and its tragedy when she finally confronts Achilles. The Greek hero, still consumed by grief for Patroclus and the weight of his own rage, sees in the Amazon a worthy enemy. Their duel is described with solemnity. Spears fly, shields crash, and even the gods watch attentively. Penthesilea fights with brilliance, but Achilles is invincible. She is mortally wounded, and in that moment, something extraordinary happens. As Achilles removes her helmet and sees her face, he falls in love with her at the moment of her death. It is an impossible, cruel love, born of destruction. Some versions say he mourned deeply. Others claim he was mocked by Vantrundersites, a vulgar soldier, and killed him for disrespecting the Amazon's body. Either way, that instant revealed something beyond the warrior, the realization that even an enemy can embody beauty, nobility, and sorrow. The presence of the Amazons in the Trojan War was not decisive in military terms. They did not alter the course of events or prevent the city's fall, but symbolically, they represented a rupture. They brought into war the feminine in its most fierce, courageous, and sovereign form. These were women who did not wait behind walls. They rode to the front lines, who did not mourn sons. They wielded spears like priestesses of death. The legend of Penthesilea lived on for centuries as an echo of an alternate world, where courage was not a male monopoly. In Roman mosaics, Greek vases, and later tragedies, Penthesilea became one of the most powerful symbols of tragic resistance. Not because she won, but because she fought. Not because she killed, but because she died looking into the eyes of the one who destroyed her. In the war's final act, the unexpected emerged. The duel between the hero of Greece and the daughter of Ares. There, in the dust of the battlefield, love and death blurred once again, and time paused for a moment, just to remind us that even in absolute brutality, beauty could still appear like a flash before the final darkness. The death of Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War, was not merely the end of a man, it was the end of an era. From the moment he set foot on the battlefield, his presence had been the beating heart of the Greek campaign. Every enemy feared his shadow. Every ally depended on his strength. His name was whispered with reverence, as if he were more myth than man, and in many ways, he was. Son of Thetis, a sea goddess, and the mortal Keter Peleus, Achilles had been forged at the threshold between the human and the divine. War had not spared him from loss, trauma, or fury, but now about to fulfill his destiny. The hero who could not be defeated in battle would fall to a distant, silent, and precise strike. The prophecy had always loomed. Achilles would live only as long as Hector did. By killing the Trojan prince, he had sealed his own fate. His mother Thetis had tried to protect him since birth, by dipping him in the river Styx to make him invulnerable. But she had held him by the heel, which remained untouched and mortal. That small blind spot would become the key to his ruin. The gods, torn between admiration and envy, watched with cold eyes. It was Apollo, patron of the Trojans, who would guide the fatal blow. Directing the hand of Parisum, Hector's brother, the god made a single arrow fly across the battlefield and to strike Achilles in the one place he was vulnerable, the heel. The hero fell, not in glorious hand-to-hand combat, but brought down from afar by a man who could never have faced him as an equal. Achilles' death was a shock. The Greeks, disbelieving, recovered his body and guarded it fiercely. His funeral was grand, fit for a demigod. Around his pyre, funeral games were held, contests of strength, speed, and strategy. But amidst the grief and reverence, a new conflict arose. Who would inherit his armor? The armor forged by Hephaestus, touched by the fire of the gods, the ultimate symbol of Greek heroism. Two warriors emerged as natural contenders: Ajax, the strongest and bravest after Achilles, and Odysseus, the most cunning and versatile of the Greek kings. The contest, however, would not be settled by battle but by speech. In front of the Council of Kings, each presented his case. Ajax, noble and direct, spoke of his valor in combat, his constant loyalty, how he had defended the ships, saved his comrades, and never retreated. He was the natural heir to Achilles' strength. Odysseus, however, spoke of strategy and intellect, of how his mind had saved the Greeks more times than could be counted. He spoke with eloquence, wooed hearts with logic and poetry, and in the end, the judges awarded the armor to Odysseus. Ajax, humiliated and wounded in his honor, went mad. In a fit of rage, he slaughtered animals in the camp, believing them to be his enemies. When sanity returned and he saw what he had done, he took his own life, thrusting his sword into his chest. The fall of Achilles, followed by the moral collapse of Ajax, marked the crumbling of the greatest pillars of the Greek war effort. Heroes were falling not only to Trojan hands, but to the machinations of gods, internal rivalries, and the weight of a war that had surpassed all reason. Achilles had been the Greek shield. Now he lay buried beneath a monumental tomb by the sea. His death sealed the war's final chapter. The gods began to withdraw. The men began to look for alternatives. And Odysseus, now clad in the hero's armor, began to devise what would become the war's final act, the wooden horse. But before the horse, before the end, there remained the void left by Achilles. His absence weighed heavier than his presence. His footsteps no longer shook the sand. His spear no longer carved paths. The war without him was only dust and smoke. To the Greeks, Achilles had become eternal, and to Troy, his memory was the name that echoed in the terror of the night. The war had lost its greatest warrior, but in his death it had gained an immortal symbol. After a decade of siege, countless deaths, and divine interventions, the Trojan War seemed to sink into stagnation. The Greeks, even without Achilles, kept attacking. The Trojans, even without Hector, still resisted. But the war was no longer decided by the strength of spears or the number of warriors. It had become a war of attrition, of corroded faith, of fragile alliances. And in this landscape of exhaustion, the only resource left unexplored emerged: deception. It was Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, the most cunning among the Greeks, who conceived the plan that would end the war, not with direct bloodshed, but with ingenuity, symbolism, and silence. What could not be conquered by walls or by gods would be undone by an idea, and that idea took the shape of wood, a horse, and betrayal. The plan was simple in appearance, but heavy with hidden meanings. The Greeks would pretend to abandon the siege, leaving behind a gift: a colossal wooden horse made from dismantled ships, hollow inside, and large enough to conceal an elite group. The horse, a sacred animal to the Trojans and a recurring symbol in their culture, would be offered as a gift to the gods, a sign of surrender and final tribute. The rest of the army would feign departure and retreat. In truth, they would hide nearby on the surrounding islands, waiting for the moment to return. Inside the horse, Odysseus, Menelaus, Neoptolemus, Diomedes, and other heroes waited in silence for the gates to open. The horse was left on the sands before the walls. At dawn, the Trojans discovered the Colossus, and upon seeing the Greek camp abandoned, celebrated as though fate had finally turned. For the first time in years, the city breathed victory, but not everyone was convinced. Laocoon, priest of Apollo, warned the people, "I fear the Greeks, even when they bring gifts." Suspicious, he hurled a spear into the horse, which echoed hollow but the sound was ignored. Then, as if in divine censorship, two giant serpents emerged from the sea and nigh devoured Laocoon and his sons, a scene the Trojans interpreted as punishment from the gods. The warning was silenced. The horse was pulled inside the city. Cassandra, the cursed prophetess, also warned that the sculpture was a trap, but as always her voice was ignored. Troy rejoiced. Rituals were held. The gates were opened. The horse, symbol of victory, crossed the walls and was placed at the center of the city as a sacred trophy. At night, while the Trojans slept, exhausted from celebration and drunk on relief, the men hidden within the horse opened the hatches and descended silently. At the same time, they signaled the Greek fleet, returning under the cover of darkness. The gates were opened from within, and Antiquity, the city, was taken before it even awakened. Troy, the city undefeated for 9 years, fell in one night. The wooden horse was not just a tactic. It was a symbol of the ethical shift in war, the replacement of brute force with cunning, of direct courage with manipulation. It demonstrated that at the end of all glory, only the mind remains, and that the strongest walls fall when the enemy enters through the door of trust. The gods, silent, did not intervene. They were tired, perhaps ashamed, perhaps satisfied. In the end, men resolved the war in their own way. The horse remains to this day a universal metaphor, a dangerous gift, a hidden trap, beauty that deceives. Its wood in silence closed an entire age of myths, heroes, and gods. Troy would at last be set aflame. But before that, the horse would teach the world a final lesson. Not every victory comes by the sword. Sometimes it arrives in the belly of a symbol. The city of Troy, which had resisted a relentless siege for 10 years with honor, strategy, and faith, did not fall due to military weakness, but because of a single moment of misplaced trust. The wooden horse, a symbol of cunning and deceit, sealed the fate of an entire civilization. And when night fell and the gates were opened by Greek hands hidden in its belly, destruction descended with a fury not even the gods attempted to stop. There was no battle. There was massacre. What followed the opening of the gates was one of the darkest and most visceral moments in all of Greek mythology. It was not merely the fall of a city. It was the fulfillment of all prophecies, the unraveling of dynasties, the collapse of households, and the final echo of a war that exchanged glory for vengeance. With the gates thrown open and the Trojan guards still asleep from the previous day's celebrations, the Greek warriors spread like a silent wave. First, the sentinels were killed, before they even grasped what was happening. Then the rest of the army, waiting by the shore, entered through the gates, and the carnage began. No distinction was made between warriors and civilians, men or women, children or elders. Homes were invaded, temples desecrated, palaces set ablaze. The cries of terror filled the pre-dawn sky. The city that had stood for centuries as a jewel of commerce and culture in Asia Minor was now a shadow consumed by fire and blood. The royal palace was invaded, and Priam, the aged king, was slaughtered at the altar of Zeus, a sacred site meant to guarantee his safety. Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, was the executioner, and he acted without hesitation, a brutal, symbolic death that showed even the gods would be defied that night. Cassandra's prophecy came true with every strike. She, who had foreseen the end from the very beginning, was dragged by her hair to Agamemnon's tent, given as a war prize. The son of icy Andromache and Hector, little Astyanax, heir to the royal bloodline, was thrown from the city walls, a cruel act to prevent future vengeance. Hecuba, queen mother, lost all her children, and in the midst of the chaos, Helen, the woman whose flight had started it all, walked among the ruins, beautiful, untouched, desired, and hated by all. The destruction of Troy was so complete that for centuries, many doubted the city had ever existed. The ground where once princes and priestesses walked was buried under ashes, bones, and shattered stones. The temple of Athena, desecrated by Ajax the Lesser, when he dragged Cassandra from the feet of the goddess, became a divine fault line. Offended, Athena would curse the Greeks' return home. Many would drown, others go mad, and few would ever see their homelands again. The war was won, but the victory carried the weight of guilt. Those who believed war gave meaning to life realized too late that it only destroys what can never be recovered. The prophecies that spanned the war were fulfilled with tragic precision. Troy would fall only when Hector was dead, when the bow of Heracles was wielded, and when the greatest Greek, Achilles, had been sacrificed. All was fulfilled, and even amid the destruction, a few survivors carried the memory of the city with them. Aeneas, one of the few spared heroes, would flee with his father on his back and his son in hand, guided by Venus, a flight that, according to Roman tradition, would lead to the founding of the future city of Rome. Troy perished, but left its seeds in distant lands, as if to reaffirm that although walls crumble, stories are never extinguished. The destruction of Troy was more than a military outcome. It was a civilizational catastrophe, an eternal warning against the excesses of pride, the limits of vengeance, and the price of ignoring signs. No god saved Troy. No mortal could prevent what had been fated since the apple of discord. The city that had resisted everything fell through its own trust. The disunity of men and the indifference of the divine. The flames consumed the palaces, but not the words. And so, among ruins and songs, Troy survived in the verses of poets. The ultimate example that even the greatest of cities can be destroyed, but never forgotten. In the heart of Troy's palace, surrounded by the columns that once supported the councils of elders and the banquets of princes, lay a man who had seen the world turn to ruin, Priam. The old king, last sovereign of a legendary lineage, watched with his own eyes the complete destruction of everything he had ruled for decades. The man who once presided over the richest and most powerful city in Asia Minor was now without a crown, without a throne, without sons, without temple, without defense. At the height of the Greek invasion, he sought refuge at the altar of Saint Zeus Hercaeus, the protector god of the household, the ultimate symbol of inviolability. But not even the gods could protect the king's final act. At that sacred place, unarmed and helpless, Priam was brutally murdered, by Neoptolemus, son of Achilles. The scene was brutal. According to mythological accounts, Neoptolemus, dragged Priam by the hair to the altar, and with his sword pierced the old man, ignoring his pleas, his age, and the sanctity of the space. It was not merely a physical death. It was a moral desecration, a definitive rupture of divine order. With that blow, not only did Priam's body fall, but also the last hope of reconciling honor and power. Troy had been reduced to fire and rubble, and the man who had fought the hardest to keep his city standing died in the most undignified way, as though the gods had turned away. Priam was not merely a king. He was the symbol of human persistence in the face of immutable fate. Father of 50 sons, he saw his lineage annihilated one by one. Hector, his brightest heir, slain by Achilles. Paris, the war's instigator, struck by Philoctetes' arrow. Deiphobus, killed by Menelaus. Troilus, fallen in battle as a child. Polypsa, murdered before his eyes while fleeing in vain to the altar. Each son represented a possibility of continuity, and each death was a deep wound in the memory of the royal house. Priam's blood staining the altar sealed the end of the Dardanian dynasty, begun by Dardanus, son of Zeus. As for the royal women, their fates were equally tragic. Hecuba, the queen, was taken as a slave. Some versions say she went mad upon witnessing the deaths of so many children and the city reduced to ashes. Others claim she was transformed into a dog out of divine pity, condemned to howl eternally along the shores of the Hellespont. Cassandra, the prophetess, was raped and made prisoner by Agamemnon. Andromache, Hector's wife, saw her son murdered and became the captive of Neoptolemus, the very man who had slain her father-in-law. Priam's women, once queens and princesses, were reduced to war spoils with no right to voice, choice, or mourning. Yet not all of Priam's lineage was extinguished. Amid the darkness of Troy's fall, a faint flame of continuity rose. Aeneas, Hector's cousin and son of the goddess Aphrodite, managed to escape with a small group of survivors. He carried his father, Anchises, on his shoulders and held his son, Ascanius, by the hand. Guided by dreams, stars, and divine protection, he sailed across the Mediterranean, facing shipwrecks and wars until he reached Latium in the Italian peninsula. From his lineage, according to Roman myth, the city of Chandromchas would one day arise, transplanting the blood of Troy into a new empire. Thus, Priam's bloodline did not end. It was reborn in another soil to blossom into another story. The death of Priam represents the end, of an ancient order. He was the last king of a mythical era where men spoke with gods, where honor was measured in gestures rather than speeches, where cities fell due to passions and not calculations. With him vanished the marble Troy, with its markets, temples, and songs. What remained were ruins, dust, and memory. But memory endures, not in stones, but in words, not in thrones, but in tragedies. Priam's name, wrapped in sorrow and dignity, would live on in Homer's verses, in Alexander's courts, in the dreams of emperors seeking to legitimize their glory by linking themselves to the fallen lineage of the king who died with the city at his feet. The Trojan War had ended, but its shadow was far from gone. With the city destroyed, palaces looted, and heirs slaughtered, the Greek armies gathered on the shores to return home. They expected to carry with them the pride of victory, the riches of conquest, and eternal glory sung by poets. But what they did not know, or refused to acknowledge, was that the gods were not satisfied. The desecration of temples, sacrilege against priestesses, ignored prophecies, and the blood spilled upon altars demanded a price, and that price would not be paid in battle, but on the journey home. What seemed like the end of the road would become the beginning of an odyssey of punishment, curses, and shipwrecks, where even their homeland seemed to reject the return of its heroes. The first to feel the wrath of the gods was the army of Chantus Agamemnon, supreme commander of the expedition. Throughout the war, he had committed acts that offended both mortals and gods. He sacrificed his own daughter, Iphigenia, to appease the winds before departure. He seized Briseis from Achilles, igniting a feud that nearly destroyed the Greek coalition, and in the end, he took Cassandra, priestess of Apollo, as a captive. His return to Patimini Mycenae was triumphant only in appearance. Waiting for him at home was Clytemnestra, his wife, consumed by years of rage and betrayal. With the help of her lover, Aegisthus, she murdered Agamemnon in his bath, killing Cassandra as well. Victory at Troy could not shield him from defeat at home. He returned with trophies, only to be welcomed with a blade. The cycle of blood continued. Others didn't even have the chance to make it back. Ajax the Lesser, who violated Cassandra in Athena's temple, was struck by a storm sent by the goddess. His ship wrecked. Though he briefly survived, he boasted of his escape as if by his own merit. That was enough for one Poseidon, to split the rock on which he stood, drowning him in the sea. Menelaus, husband of Helen and king of Sparta, was also plagued by storms and wandering tides. His voyage lasted 8 years, forcing him to roam through Egypt and unknown lands before finally returning. Helen, the woman whose beauty launched 1,000 ships, returned to her throne, but never to her people's hearts. Sparta tolerated her. It never forgave her. And then there was Odysseus, perhaps the most cursed of all. Despite orchestrating victory through the wooden horse, it was his cunning that drew the gods' ire. After Troy's fall, Odysseus and his men were condemned to wander the world, facing monsters, sorceresses, shipwrecks, and even the dead. His tale would be immortalized in the Odyssey, where he faced cyclopes, sirens, giants, storms, and shades. His journey home would last him 10 years, and cost the lives of all his men. Odysseus would return to Ithaca alone, disguised as a beggar, only to find his throne usurped by suitors and his wife, Penelope, on the verge of despair. His final triumph would not be military, but domestic, quiet and painful. The truth was simple. The Greeks won the war, but lost the peace. Their gods were not just, they were vengeful. They demanded respect for rituals, sacred hierarchies, and the laws of fate. The heroes who defied these rules were punished. Those who forgot humility, drowned. Those who ignored signs, paid in blood. Instead of crowns and feasts, the Greeks' return was marked by graves, tears, and silence. In many cases, the victors never saw their homeland again, and those who did returned so changed, so scarred, that they were strangers in their own homes. The Trojan War, then, did not end at the city gates, but on distant Greek shores, in the stormy Aegean Sea, and in the moonless nights of those who wandered without direction. It was a war that continued us in the memories of survivors, in the judgment of the gods, and in the generations that followed, who inherited more mourning than glory. The men who had left young and hopeful came back old, distrusting, haunted by the ghosts they left behind. The war made them legends, but legends are made of loss, not victory. When Troy was consumed by flames and Priam's lineage nearly extinguished, one man walked against fate. His name was Aeneas, son of the goddess Aphrodite, and the mortal Anchises, and his story would not end in the ruins of the fallen city. Unlike great heroes like Achilles or Hector, who fought to the death for glory or honor, Aeneas was chosen for a different purpose: to survive. Guided by a mission greater than combat, he became the bearer of what remained of Troy's soul. And in the silence of escape, amid ruins and smoke, he rose not as a warrior, but as a symbol of continuity, of memory, and of promise. According to the Aeneid, the monumental work written by Virgil centuries later, Aeneas received orders from his divine mother to flee. Unlike many heroes who sought an honorable death, he was instructed to live, a decision harder than dying. As the palaces crumbled, he carried his elderly father Anchises on his shoulders and held his son Ascanius, also called Iulus, by the hand. Behind them, his wife, Creusa, was lost in the burning streets, perishing before she could be saved. But Aeneas did not stop. He did not fight for vengeance, he fought for the future, and thus with a group of survivors, he set sail into the unknown, a journey that would last years and cross continents. His odyssey was no less epic than that of Odysseus. He crossed stormy seas, endured tempests sent by Juno, queen of the gods, who hated the Trojans. He passed through islands inhabited by monsters, hostile cities, and even the underworld, where he encountered his father's spirit and saw visions of his descendants' future glory. In Carthage, he met Dido, the queen who fell in love with him and envisioned a shared life. But Aeneas was reminded by the gods of his destiny. Not love, but Rome awaited him. He departed in secret, and Dido, devastated, took her own life, cursing him. According to myth, her curse would give rise to the eternal hatred between Rome and Carthage. After years of wandering, Aeneas and his followers finally reached Latium in the Italian peninsula. There he encountered King Latinus, who offered him hospitality and the hand of his daughter, Lavinia. But this new beginning would not come without blood. The promise of marriage provoked the wrath of the Turnus, a local prince who also sought Lavinia's hand. A new war began, and Aeneas, once more, had to fight. This time, not to save a dying city, but to build one yet to be born. In the end, he killed Turnus in combat, sealing peace through the union of Trojans and Latins. From this marriage would arise a new lineage, from which Romulus, the future founder of Rome, would descend. Aeneas's story is not merely an epilogue to the Trojan War, it is its transformation into origin. While the Greeks returned home with gold and tragedies, the Trojans departed without a homeland, but with a destiny. Rome, the empire that would dominate the ancient world, presented itself as the direct heir of Troy's defeated. Loss became power, exile became foundation, and pain became glory. Through his epic, Virgil granted Rome a mythical past to rival that of the Greeks, and Aeneas, the quiet hero, became the bridge between two worlds, the link between a fallen East and a rising West. This narrative is not only political or poetic, it is deeply symbolic. The ancient world, especially the Romans, saw in Aeneas the figure of the man who carries the past while building the future. A hero not celebrated for combat, but for resilience, for responsibility, for fidelity to the mission imposed by gods and blood. Aeneas did not destroy kingdoms, he founded legacies, and that legacy would echo through centuries in the coins of emperors, in marble temples, in the verses of poets, and on the maps of conquests that stretched to the ends of the known world. In the end, the Trojan War did not vanish with burnt walls or fallen heroes. It survived in Aeneas's ships, in Ascanius's footprints, in Virgil's words, and in Rome's columns. A war sparked by passion, fought for honor, and ended by cunning, gave rise to the longest-lasting civilization. The Trojan flame, once threatened by the winds of destruction, was rekindled in another land under another name, but with the same memory. Far beyond the battlefield, the ruined walls and the flames that consumed Troy, the war lived on in what may be its most powerful form: literature. No mythical conflict has had such poetic, philosophical and symbolic reverberation as the Trojan War. Homer, Virgil, Aeschylus, Euripides, Seneca all drank from the same source, yet told different stories. Each verse, each tragedy, each hexameter became an immortal brick in the construction of one of the most influential narratives in human history. The real war, if it ever existed, was forgotten by time. But the war sung in poems never ended, and it is there that Troy, its heroes and its sorrows, remain more alive than in any archaeological ruin. The best known and oldest of these works is the Iliad, attributed to the blind poet Ides Homer, likely composed in the 8th century before Christ. Although it deals with the Trojan War, it does not narrate the entire conflict. Instead, it focuses on a specific episode, the wrath of Achilles. The poem begins with a quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles and culminates in the death of Hector, Troy's great defender. This narrow focus transforms the Iliad into a work about the internal conflict of heroes, more than the war itself. Rage, honor, friendship, loss, and the inevitability of death are its central themes. War, though constantly present, serves as a backdrop to examine the human condition in the face of fate and fleeting glory. Alongside the Iliad, but written centuries later, emerges the Aeneid by Virgil, commissioned by the Roman Emperor Augustus. The Aeneid sought to build a national identity for Rome, based on a Trojan origin. Aeneas, the protagonist, is not driven by wrath, but by duty. Unlike Achilles, he seeks no personal glory. He endures loss, renounces passion, carries the old and guides the young. Virgil uses the epic language to turn the fall of Troy into a seed of rebirth. Rome, therefore, is not presented as Greece's enemy, but as its tragic successor. The fall of Troy is no longer an end. It becomes a new beginning. On the stages of Greece and later Rome, tragedy reclaimed fragments of this war. Euripides, for example, wrote plays such as The Trojan Women, Hecuba and Andromache, which show the horrors of war not through the eyes of warriors, but of the Trojan women after defeat. These are deeply human and moving works that expose the void behind Greek victory and the pain of the vanquished. In them there is no glory, only mourning, slavery, and despair. In The Trojan Women, we see Hecuba, Andromache, and Cassandra awaiting their fate as captives. In Hecuba, the queen who once ruled becomes a grieving mother, desperate for justice. The female voice, so often silenced in epics, takes center stage here. In imperial Rome, Seneca, the Stoic philosopher and playwright, revisited these themes with intense philosophical depth. In his Latin adaptations of Greek tragedies, the Trojan War is reinterpreted through a Stoic lens of pessimism. The futility of passion, the destruction wrought by pride, the uselessness of violence, all are magnified as a mirror of Rome's own decadence. The war that once symbolized heroism becomes a metaphor for self-destruction, as if the empire itself were poised to repeat the errors of the Achaeans and Trojans. As centuries passed, the Trojan War kept resurfacing in new forms. In the Middle Ages, it was retold in chivalric romances, where Greek heroes wore medieval armor. In the Renaissance, Shakespeare referenced its characters in Troilus and Cressida. In the 20th century, authors like Jean Giraudoux and Christa Wolf reimagined the events with existential and feminist perspectives. To this day, the Trojan War inspires films, books, music, and series, not because we need the battles, but because we need to understand the eternal conflicts they symbolize. Desire, pride, loss, fate, survival, and redemption. In the end, the Trojan War survived not because it was won or lost, but because it was written, because its sorrows were narrated, its deaths sung, its ruins described with beauty, grief, and precision. And perhaps, between the lines of each poem, there lies something more enduring than any stone wall, the certainty that as long as there are words, Troy will never truly fall. For centuries it was believed that Troy was nothing more than a myth, a poetic invention created by Homer, sustained by verses, not by stones. Its war, its heroes, its walls, all seem to belong to the symbolic fabric of Greek culture, with no concrete connection to solid ground. The absence of material evidence reinforced this belief. There were no visible ruins, no reliable maps, no historical records that could confirm its existence. However, the persistence of doubt always generated fascination. And it was that doubt which, in the 19th century, drove one man to search for Troy, not in poetry, but beneath the earth. His name was Heinrich Schliemann, and his work would forever alter the boundary between myth and reality. Schliemann was a self-taught man, a wealthy merchant obsessed with Homer. Convinced that the Iliad contained historical elements, he devoted himself to finding the real location of Troy. Based on ancient geographical descriptions and the accounts of travelers, he focused his search on the region of Ahizar Lake, in present-day northwestern Turkey, near the Dardanelles, a strategically logical area for controlling maritime routes. In 1870, Schliemann began his excavations, and what he found exceeded all expectations. Layers upon layers of ruins, stacked like pages in a millennia-old book. It was as if several cities had been born, grown, destroyed, and rebuilt on the same spot, one atop another, over centuries. These layers, identified by archaeologists as Troy I to Troy IX, represent different periods of human occupation, dating from the 3rd millennium before Christ to the Roman period. The layer that most intrigues scholars is Troy VII, dated to around the 12th century before Christ, precisely the time suggested by the myths as the period of the war. Troy VII shows signs of violent destruction, hastily rebuilt homes, and unusually large food stores, all signs of a prolonged siege. While it cannot be proven that it was conquered by Achaeans led by Agamemnon, it can be said with some certainty that there was indeed a powerful city that was besieged and destroyed during this era. However, Schliemann's enthusiasm also caused problems. His excavation methods were rudimentary and often destructive. To reach the deepest layers, he violently removed upper layers, destroying valuable records from other periods. Moreover, he claimed to have found the treasure of Priam, jewels and valuable objects that he said belonged to the Trojan royal family. Later archaeologists, however, determined that the treasure came from a much older layer, Troy Isanxu, and thus could not have belonged to Priam. Still, the discovery was crucial in rekindling global interest in the archaeology of Homeric Troy. In the years that followed, more careful and scientific excavations were carried out by archaeologists like Wilhelm Dürpfeld and Carl Blegen, who refined the chronology of the layers and brought a more technical and critical approach to the investigation. In the 20th and early 21st centuries, under the leadership of Manfred Kaufmann, new excavations and geophysical analyses revealed outer walls, harbors, peripheral neighborhoods, and a level of urban complexity that positioned Troy as an influential city-state, likely acting as a mediator between the Mycenaean world and Anatolian civilizations. Troy was more than a walled fortress. It was a commercial, political, and military center embedded in broader networks of power. Today, the archaeological site of Troy is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, attracting visitors from around the world. Although it may never be confirmed with certainty that this city is exactly the Troy of the Iliad, the current consensus is that the myth was born from something real. The war described by Homer may have been a poetic crystallization of various regional conflicts, condensed into a single narrative. The historical Troy may not have fallen because of Helen, but due to commercial disputes, control of maritime routes, or local rivalries. Myth and history do not cancel each other, they intertwine. What the verses magnified, the earth confirmed in silence and stone. The archaeology of Troy proves that myths are more than inventions. They are echoes of collective memories, reinterpreted, sung, celebrated, and sometimes buried. The excavation of Troy did not dispel the epic's magic. On the contrary, it intensified it. Because now, when we read Homer's verses, we can imagine real winds sweeping through the ruins, walls rising again in our minds, and heroes treading on soil that truly existed. And thus, between myth and matter, Troy remains alive, not merely as invented story, but as a real place where time chose to leave visible traces of an eternal past. The Trojan War, though shrouded in gods, heroes, and myths, is perhaps the most enduring archetypal mirror of human warfare. Not merely an ancient clash between Greeks and Trojans, it is the original war, the one that defines, condenses, and repeats all the essential elements of future conflicts. When we examine its causes, its characters, its duration, and its consequences, we realize that Troy has transcended the boundaries of myth to become a symbolic model of the recurring destruction that humanity perpetuates. Within it lie the seeds of all that would follow: national pride, the hunger for conquest, the impulse for revenge, the sacrifice of innocence, and a ruin that redeems nothing. At the heart of the conflict lies a personal act of desire that transforms into a collective war, the abduction of Helen, or her flight, depending on the version. This private, intimate gesture is quickly elevated to a national offense. The sense of possession, wounded male honor, diplomatic humiliation, and calls for justice converge to mobilize armies. Just like so many real wars throughout history, an apparently isolated cause unleashes large-scale geopolitical movements, involving alliances, oaths, strategies, and ancient rivalries. War, then, is never about a single cause. It is the accumulation of latent tensions that finally find an emotional spark. Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, Aeneas, and others become universal types. Achilles is the warrior driven by personal glory, fighting with fury and dying young. Hector is the defender of the homeland, the man who fights for his home, his child, his city, the reluctant soldier. Odysseus is the strategist, the man of reason, whose cunning replaces brute force. And Aeneas is the survivor, the one who understands that to live often means to make silent sacrifices. Each of them represents a psychological dimension of war. And across the centuries, these figures have been reinterpreted in modern generals, ordinary soldiers, state leaders, and refugees. Troy does not merely repeat as historical event, it replicates as the symbolic structure of war itself. Another archetypal element present in Troy is the idea of war as a tragic cycle, one that does not end with victory, but continues upon return. The Iliad ends with Hector's death, yet the conflict persists. The city falls, but the survivors, both Greek and Trojan, face new traumas at home. This silent post-war phase, where there are no more battles but still last ghosts, is a fundamental feature of modern warfare. Troy had already foreshadowed millennia ago that destruction does not end when hostilities cease. It lingers in ruined homes, scarred bodies, mourning families, and narratives caught between pride and regret. The use of cunning, symbolized by the wooden horse, also became a universal symbol of strategic betrayal, of victory gained not through valor, but through deceit. That image would reappear countless times throughout history. False treaties, ambushes, Machiavellian strategies that result in devastating triumphs. The Trojan horse is more than a tactical marvel. It is the symbol of broken trust, of enemy infiltration through deception, a theme that has marked not only warfare, but also politics, espionage, diplomacy, and technology. Moreover, Troy presents the fundamental element of tragic inevitability. Everyone seems to know in some way that the conflict will end in ruin, yet they march toward it anyway. Cassandra prophesies but is not heard. Priam hesitates but is pressured. Achilles withdraws but returns. This structure of tragic anticipation, where fate is known but ignored, is one of the most powerful metaphors for the human condition. It expresses the repetitive nature of war. Knowing past mistakes does not prevent their recurrence, as if we are trapped in a psychological and cultural cycle that feeds itself. Finally, Troy also stands as the archetype of war as collective memory. No other ancient conflict, real or mythical, has been so frequently revisited over the centuries, not only because of its epic scale, but because it contains all wars condensed into one. The pride that precedes the fall, the love that triggers destruction, the glory that costs a life, the silence that follows victory. That is why Troy is not merely the beginning of a literary genre, it is the mythological mold of human conflict, through which all subsequent wars would be understood and retold. Behind the solemn aura of epic poetry and the stone ruins of a fallen city lie fascinating details that reveal contradictions, exaggerations, and hidden truths about the Trojan War. This section is dedicated to exploring historical and mythical curiosities, from the supposed weapons and armor used on the battlefield to narrative enigmas that defy logic, including chronological inconsistencies, archaeological contradictions, and even deliberate poetic inventions. The Trojan War, after all, is a mosaic of layers, and the deeper we dig, the more we realize that legend is no less complex than history itself. Let us begin with the weapons and armor described by Homer. In the Iliad, Trojan and Achaean warriors are depicted with bronze armor, ornate shields, long spears, short swords, and horsehair-crested helmets. However, the level of aesthetic detail is so high that many of these descriptions seem more like poetic idealizations than technical accounts. The famous shield of Achilles, forged by Hephaestus, for example, contains images of the entire world: cities, fields, trials, dances, harvests, as if it were a portable symbolic universe, rather than a defensive tool. Archaeologically, many of the weapons described align with the late Mycenaean period, but are mixed with elements from other eras, creating a fascinating anachronism. Another curious point is the number of combatants. The myths claim that around 1,000 Greek ships crossed the Aegean Sea to besiege Troy, an epic number that, in practice, would imply a massive fleet for the Bronze Age. If each ship carried 50 men, that would total 50,000 warriors, a figure utterly improbable for that time. Most historians believe these numbers were deliberately hyperbolic and symbolic, perhaps intended to emphasize the grandeur of the Greek coalition. Meanwhile, excavations at Troy have revealed a relatively small city, raising further questions about the balance between the scale of the legend and the archaeological reality. Among the narrative contradictions, one of the most debated is the figure of Helen. In some versions, such as the Iliad, she is portrayed as regretful, melancholic, almost a prisoner of circumstance. But in other accounts, like Euripides' tragedy Helen, she never went to Troy at all. The goddess Hera supposedly placed a phantom or illusionary copy in her stead, while the real Helen was taken to Egypt. This version not only contradicts the Homeric tradition, but also challenges the very premise of the war. If Helen was never there, did the Greeks fight for a ghost? This deeply symbolic narrative suggests that many wars are waged over illusions, projections, or empty symbols, rather than concrete realities. The famous Trojan horse is also a subject of speculation. Archaeologists and scholars have hypothesized that the horse may actually have been a coded reference to a battering ram, a wooden contraption used to break gates, or perhaps a mythological symbol, representing internal betrayal, maybe a gate opened by spies. Some texts suggest that the horse was a metaphor later taken literally, a common transformation in oral narratives that are eventually transcribed. Regardless of whether it existed, its symbolic power remains intact, a victory achieved through cunning and deception, not brute force. There are also inconsistencies in the genealogies and character arcs. In some sources, Menelaus forgives Helen and returns with her to Sparta. In others, she is stoned by the people. Paris, in certain accounts, dies nobly. In others, his death is almost humiliating. Odysseus is the rational hero of the Iliad, but in Euripides' tragedies, he appears cold and manipulative. Aeneas, to the Greeks, was a secondary figure. To the Romans, he was the founder of their imperial identity. These conflicting versions show how the same characters can be rewritten to reflect the cultural, moral, or political values of each era, revealing more about the storytellers than the events themselves. Finally, there are intriguing geographical and cultural curiosities. The site of Troy, now identified with Hisarlik, lies at a strategic crossroads between Europe and Asia. This suggests that, more than a war for love, the conflict may have stemmed from commercial and political disputes over maritime routes between emerging civilizations. The city sat at the center of a vital passage connecting the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea, and controlling it meant regional and economic dominance. This historical perspective reinforces the idea that myth is a symbolic layer built atop a real, tangible conflict. These curiosities, legendary weapons, characters with multiple versions, exaggerated symbols, and archaeological gaps, make the Trojan War not only a grand epic but also a permanent cultural enigma that continues to generate interpretations, doubts, and fascination. It is precisely this mix of ambiguities between fact and myth that makes Troy inexhaustible. A story where every certainty opens the door to new questions. Over the course of 3 millennia, civilizations have risen and fallen, empires have been built and collapsed, belief systems have been replaced, and entire languages have disappeared. Yet Troy remains. not as a military power, nor as the capital of an empire, but as a symbol, a flame that still burns in poems, ruins, works of art, classrooms, modern performances, and the internal conflicts of the human soul. The Trojan War was never merely a historical episode. It became a narrative foundation of the human condition, a milestone that transcends its origin to inhabit the space where myth, memory, and identity merge. We speak of Troy because, in some way, we are still living within it. Troy's persistence in the collective imagination is due in part to the power of Homer's poetry. The Iliad is not merely a record of war, it is a masterpiece of human sensitivity. Rather than focusing solely on battles and victories, Homer presents us with raw, timeless emotions. Priam's grief, Achilles' wounded pride, the silent tenderness between Hector and his son, Helen's hesitation before the mirror. These moments are so deeply human, so recognizable in any era, that Troy ceases to be a place on a map and becomes an internal territory where we all fight personal battles. Troy also endures because it lies at the origin of major cultural narratives. From its fall came Aeneas' flight, which, according to Virgil's Aeneid, would lead to the founding of Rome. From destruction, a new empire was born, as if Western civilization itself had its roots in that original blaze. Moreover, the central themes of the Trojan War, betrayal, honor, fate, love, and revenge, are replayed endlessly in Greek tragedies, Shakespearean dramas, modern novels, films, series, and songs. Troy is like a narrative genetic code, a foundational structure that reappears in new forms, always alive. There is also the archaeological fascination. The excavations at Hizalik gave the legend a physical body, the idea that a millennia-old poem could contain a real historical core, strengthened the belief across generations that past and fiction can coexist. The walls, artifacts, and ashes of destruction all connect imagination to reality. With each discovered fragment, Troy is recreated not as fantasy, but as part of human reality. This dialogue between stone and word grants the city a form of eternity that few myths have achieved. Troy also survives because it mirrors the present. In every new war, in every crisis, in every act of unchecked pride, in every sacrifice born of political or emotional choices, we relive the same dilemmas once staged there. Should we act for honor or for love? Is glory worth the suffering? What makes us heroes and what turns us into ruins? When we reread Troy, we are not seeking answers from the past, but reading recognition of who we are now. The myth, in this sense, serves as a lens, magnifying and revealing patterns we might prefer to ignore. And finally, we speak of Troy because we have never fully abandoned it. Even when we doubt its gods, even when we critique its exaggerations, even when we question its numbers, we return to it. Because something in Troy draws us in. Perhaps the idea that a single gesture, a flight, a broken promise, a choice, can change the fate of an entire world. Troy reminds us that the greatest stories are born from the clash between human desire and forces beyond our control. And that is why, even millennia later, when the silence of night mixes with the sound of rain, we return to tell its story, not because it has ended, but because it continues to unfold, within us, around us, in our dreams, fears, and hopes.